I can't even hold a hammer anymore. It's gone. I was born for this.
A stranger walks into a forest full of monsters and saves an entire elven village with a single sword strike. They welcome him as a hero. He marries the chief's sister under cherry blossoms, the first outsider to ever wed an elf. And none of them know that the man holding the blade is a scarred blacksmith who can barely hold a hammer in real life. This is his story. A man in a tailored suit stood on a stage bathed in spotlights, facing a massive audience. His name was Lee Si-jin, and he was the mind behind Aegis, a virtual reality experience that had consumed the planet. Aegis is not a game, he told the crowd. Every character inside it is driven by true artificial intelligence. They have personalities, judgment, will. What you're looking at isn't a simulation, it's another world. The audience stared in disbelief. Aegis had launched in 2045, and within a year, over 1 billion users had logged in. The technology was so advanced that real-world skills, martial arts, archery, craftsmanship, carried over into the virtual world. Players didn't just play, they lived. Inside Aegis, one challenge had become legendary, the wooden dummy. Break it in 10 strikes, and the reward was a VVIP capsule worth 50 million won and a permanent boost to every stat. Simple rules, impossible execution, over 1 billion attempts, 0 successes. Players gathered around it like tourists at a monument. A gold medalist in kendo had tried and failed. Professional athletes had walked away humiliated. Most people had stopped trying altogether. Then, a mountain of a man pushed through the crowd. They called him Madosok, the strongest primate alive. Rumors said he'd killed a bear with his bare hands. The wooden dummy looked like a toothpick next to him. The crowd held its breath, certain this was finally the moment. He wound up, struck with everything he had. The ground cracked. The air split. The dummy didn't break. The notification flashed cold and final. Challenge failed. Back in the monitoring room, the analysts slumped. One rubbed his face. It's over. His colleague was already grabbing her coat. Let's get out before the complaints start flooding in. They shuffled toward the door, arguing over who was paying for dinner, both half joking about quitting. Nobody believed the dummy could be broken anymore. The media was sharpening its knives, ready to accuse Aegis of running an impossible publicity stunt. The challenge had become a joke. Then, something changed. A new figure appeared at the dummy. No crowd cheered. No cameras rolled. He was dressed in the plain starter gear that every beginner received. Clothes so basic they might as well have been pajamas. But the sword in his hand was different. It gleamed with a weight and presence that didn't belong in the beginner zone. Inside the command center, someone glanced at the monitor. Boss, look, another one. The bearded supervisor barely reacted. They'd seen thousands of challengers. This one would fail like the rest. The young man squared his stance. He wasn't massive. He wasn't famous. He was just a guy who looked like he'd wandered in off the street. But when he raised that sword, something shifted in the air. He swung. The first strike was precise. The second was harder. By the 8th strike, the dummy exploded into splinters. A global message erupted across every server in the world. The wooden dummy had been destroyed. In the monitoring room, a coffee cup shattered on the floor. The female analyst's hands trembled over her keyboard. That's impossible. Who still has that kind of power? Her colleague leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. Madosok was supposed to be the last hope. This guy is just a regular person. Check the sword, someone barked. Check its grade, now. Fingers flew across keys. The data loaded. The sword was called Gwangmyeong, Epic Class. Attack power of 143. Durability 3000. No restrictions for the creator. And the creator was the user himself. A level 1 player who had never left the beginner zone. The room went silent. He made this? The analyst's voice was barely a whisper. A level 1 user crafted an epic weapon? The supervisor stared at the screen, jaw tight. Only one master blacksmith had ever existed in the real world capable of this kind of work. And that man was lying in a hospital bed, trapped in a vegetative state after a fire that had nearly killed his son too. His son, a young man covered in burn scars. A blacksmith who hadn't touched a hammer in 3 years. A nobody who'd logged into Aegis with nothing but desperation and muscle memory. His name was Jin, and he was just getting started. The furnace roared. Heat poured off the coals in waves thick enough to choke on, and the clang of hammer on metal rang out like a heartbeat. Sparks spiraled into the dark. Jin stood at the anvil, sweat streaming down his face, striking with a rhythm that came from somewhere deeper than memory. Each blow sent a shudder through his arms and straight into his chest. For a moment, it felt real. Not the game, not Aegis, something older. He saw a figure through the shimmer of heat. broad shoulders, calloused hands. A man who had spent his entire life bent over molten steel. Jin's breath caught. "Dad," he whispered. The figure turned. Through the fire and the glow, the man smiled, warm, tired. The kind of smile that only comes from someone who has poured everything into a single craft and never once regretted it. Jin reached out. "Dad, I'll protect you," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear." The flames surged, the man's shape blurred, and then a voice, faint as smoke, drifted through the roar. "My son!" Jin's eyes snapped open. Darkness, moonlight cutting through thin curtains. His sheets were soaked, his heart hammering against his ribs. The same dream, always the same dream. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, waiting for his breathing to slow. 3 years, and the nightmares still came. The fire, the screams, the weight of his father's body on his shoulder as he dragged him out of the inferno. He rubbed his right arm, the scars twisted from his wrist to his shoulder, pale and tight against the skin. The arm that used to swing a hammer 12 hours a day could barely hold a coffee mug now. That fire had taken everything. His father's workshop, his father's consciousness, and every ounce of strength in the arm that was supposed to carry on the family legacy. The hospital lobby was bright and crowded. Jin sat in a plastic chair, hood pulled low, a mask covering the lower half of his face. He didn't like people staring. "Hey, Jin!" Sarah dropped into the chair across from him, grinning like she'd just won the lottery. She was the only person left who still bothered with him. Everyone else had drifted away after the accident, but Sarah had this stubborn streak that made her impossible to shake. "I told you not to call me during the day," Jin muttered. Yeah. She waved him off. "Listen, what do you know about Aegis?" "Aegis?" Sarah leaned forward, eyes bright. "The biggest game on the planet right now. Over 1 billion players. Super AI running the whole thing. And here's the thing." She pulled out her phone and showed him a clip of someone smashing through a stone dummy in a blaze of light. "There's this beginner challenge. Nobody's beaten it. Not a single person out of 1 billion. The reward is a VIP capsule worth 50 million won." Jin stared at the screen. 1 billion people failed, and you think we can do it? It's going to be hard, obviously, but it's not impossible. Sarah's grin widened. "Because you're not like those billion people." He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. Sarah kept talking about how the game had a blacksmith class, about how every weapon and piece of armor in Aegis could be crafted by hand if someone had the skill, about how the in-game economy let players convert gold to real money, and top crafters were pulling in serious cash. "The blacksmith class exists, Jin." She said it like it was the most important sentence in the world. "Your father was the greatest artisan in the country, and you trained under him for 10 years. You're Kang Hyunsu's son." Jin flinched at the mention of his father's real-world name. He looked down at his scarred hand. "I haven't touched a hammer in 3 years, he said quietly. "I know. My right arm is shot. I can barely grip anything. I know that too." Silence stretched between them. Sarah's expression softened, but she didn't back down. Jin stared at the bottle in his hand. Water. Cheap, convenience store water. "To be honest, I'm not in any shape to try anything." The words tasted like surrender. He hated them the moment they left his mouth, because in his mind, the fire was playing again. The forge collapsing, timber crashing down, his father pinned beneath the debris, flames eating through everything. Jin remembered running in, remembered the heat searing his skin, the smoke filling his lungs, remembered grabbing his father's arm and pulling with everything he had. "Dad, wake up! Dad!" He'd carried him out, barely, his father's weight on his ruined shoulder, stumbling through smoke and ash and falling beams. They'd both survived, technically, but his father never woke up. Just a body in a hospital bed, hooked to machines, breathing, but not there. The medical bills were crushing. Jin's family had nothing. Everyone he earned on construction sites went straight to the hospital, and it was never enough. It was never, ever enough. On the job site the next morning, a foreman handed him a hammer. "Hey, you've used one of these before, right? Go help in the back." Jin took it, felt the weight. For 1 second, the old instinct flared. 10 years of his father's training, 10 years of shaping metal from raw ore into something beautiful. The hammer felt like an extension of his arm. Then the pain hit, a white-hot spike from his wrist to his elbow. The hammer slipped from his fingers and clattered to the concrete. He stared at it. Tears burned in his eyes, and he turned away before anyone could see. Since the accident, he couldn't put strength into his right arm, the one tool he'd been born to wield, and his body wouldn't let him hold it. Sarah found him after work. She stood in front of him, arms crossed, eyes fierce. "The Jin I know wasn't like this," she said. "You told me once that you wanted to be a blacksmith for the rest of your life. That was before. You can do it in Aegis." Her voice cracked. "Don't you get it? In the game, your body works, your arm works. All that skill your father gave you, it's still in your head. Nobody can take that from you." Jin said nothing. "I'll take responsibility for the 10 million won for the capsule," Sarah said. "Every last coin. Just try." One time. That's all I'm asking." She was practically begging now, and Sarah never begged. Her eyes were red and her fists were shaking, and Jin realized she'd been carrying this plan for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Please, Jin, just once. Can't you try just once?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his hand, the scarred, useless hand that couldn't hold a hammer in the real world. "I won't push you again after this," Sarah said quietly. "Whatever you decide." The construction site at dawn, sunlight cutting through scaffolding, turning dust motes to gold. Jin stood at his station, gripping a hammer in his left hand, driving it into metal. Not graceful, not skilled, just brute repetition for minimum wage. But something had shifted. That kid Sarah really got to me, he thought. The ring of metal echoed through the site, and for the first time in 3 years, it didn't sound like a funeral bell. It sounded like a beginning. He needed money. His father's treatment wasn't going to pay for itself, and if there was even a fraction of a chance that his skills meant something in Aegis, he had to take it. "I need to focus on what I can do right now," he muttered, swinging the hammer harder. "I have to hurry. I have to earn money for Dad's treatment." The sound of metal echoed in his heart. That night, Jin put on the VR headset. The world dissolved into light. Welcome to the world of Aegis. He stood in a void of soft blue radiance, surrounded by data streams that swirled like living constellations. A system prompt materialized in front of him. "Please enter your character nickname." Jin typed his name. The system confirmed it. Character customization began. Blue energy crackled around his body, scanning him from head to toe. Jin flinched. What the hell is this? The energy intensified. Data points swarmed over his skin like fireflies, mapping every muscle, every joint. And then Jin looked down at his hand. The scars were gone. He turned his palm over, flexing his fingers. Smooth skin, full range of motion, no pain. He clenched his fist, and the strength was there. All of it. The grip that could swing a 5-kilogram hammer for 12 hours straight. "The scar," he breathed. "It's gone." A prompt appeared. "Do you wish to proceed with this appearance?" Yes. No. Yes. He said it without hesitation. In this world, he was whole. In this world, he could be what his father had raised him to be. Jin walked forward through the light, rolling his shoulders, testing his body. Everything worked. Everything responded. He laughed softly, a sound he hadn't made in a long time. "I'm going to have to work hard to pay off this debt," he murmured. But there was no bitterness in it, just resolve. The light shattered, and Jin landed on solid ground. Barden territory, Ren's forge. He stood in front of a modest blacksmith's shop under a bright blue sky. The building was weathered, but solid, with smoke curling from a chimney and the faint glow of coals visible through the open door. It looked like the kind of place his father would have loved. Inside, an old man was slumped over the anvil, snoring. Ren, the territory's blacksmith. He woke with a start and yawned hugely, blinking at Jin like he'd materialized from thin air. But Ren wasn't sleeping for long. Within the hour, Jin found him at the forge, hammering away with sloppy technique and raw desperation. Sweat poured down the old man's face as he muttered to himself, cursing instructors who had looked down on him, vowing to forge a sword that would put them all to shame. "I'll make a blade better than anything those fools ever crafted," Ren growled, slamming the hammer down again. "Come on, just work, damn it!" The metal screamed under his blows. The technique was all wrong. Too much force, no finesse. The kind of hammering that would crack a blade before it ever held an edge. Jin watched from the doorway, and then he stepped inside. "That's not how you do it," he said quietly. Ren spun around, eyes wide, hammer raised like a weapon. Jin didn't flinch. "I said, that's not how you do it." And just like that, in a forge that smelled like his father's workshop and rang with the same music he'd grown up hearing, Jin picked up a hammer for the first time in 3 years. His hand closed around the grip. No pain, no trembling, just the perfect, familiar weight of steel in his palm. He was just getting started. Ren stared at the blade on the anvil, then back at Jin. His jaw tightened. "You've only been here a few nights," he said, voice rough with suspicion. "And you think you can do better than me?" Jin met his gaze. "I know what I said sounded arrogant, but I couldn't stay quiet. Not when I can see what you're trying to build." Something shifted in the old man's expression. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. The kind that comes when a man has been failing for so long that even a fool's promise sounds worth hearing. "Fine." Ren shoved the hammer toward him. "Prove it. I've got nothing to lose." Jin wrapped his fingers around the grip. The weight settled into his palm like a handshake from an old friend. His mind was already racing. He'd planned to earn the old blacksmith's trust slowly, work his way into the forge, build a foundation. But this was better. This was a door swinging wide open. "One condition," Jin said. "If I prove myself, the sword I forge is mine to keep." Ren's eyebrows climbed his forehead. Then he laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "You've got nerve, kid. I'll give you that." He waved a hand toward the forge. "Deal." 3 years. That was how long it had been since Jin last stood over an anvil with real purpose. 3 years since the fire took his father's workshop, his arm, and everything he thought he was. But here, in this world, his body remembered what his mind had never forgotten. He lifted the hammer and brought it down. The first strike rang through the forge like a bell. Sparks erupted from the heated steel, scattering across the dark stone floor. Jin's arm moved in a rhythm that was older than thought, older than memory. It lived in his muscles, in the precise angle of his wrist, in the way his shoulder rolled with each downswing. His father had drilled this into him 10,000 times over 10 years, and not a single repetition had been wasted. Strike, turn, strike, fold. The heat pressed against his face like a living thing. Sweat carved rivers down his temples, and somewhere in the roar of the furnace and the music of steel on steel, a ghost flickered at the edge of his vision. Broad shoulders, scarred hands, a man who had poured his entire soul into a single craft. "Dad," Jin whispered between strikes. The image blurred. A hospital bed, machines beeping in the dark, a body breathing but not there. Jin's grip tightened on the hammer. He swung harder. The sparks flew higher. Ren watched from the corner of the forge, arms crossed, his expression cycling through disbelief, skepticism, and something dangerously close to wonder. At first, he'd dismissed it. Another outsider, with more confidence than skill. They came through every week, swinging hammers like they were chopping wood, producing trash that wouldn't survive a single swing. But this one was different, folding, gathering, and refining. Ren muttered under his breath, watching Jin work. That technique eliminates impurities while strengthening the steel. How did I never think of something so simple? He shook his head. No, it had to be a trick, some cheap shortcut that would fall apart under scrutiny. Ren activated his appraisal ability, and the result hit him like a fist to the chest. The steel had already jumped from grade D to grade C. He'd forged grade C steel before, sure, but never had he seen the quality climb that fast. He wasn't bluffing, Ren whispered. Still, there was a ceiling to raw technique. Without real ability, without the kind of mastery that took decades to develop, the kid would hit his limit. Ren was sure of it. This is probably as far as he can go, he told himself. He was wrong. Hours passed. The sun set and rose again, and Jin never stopped. Ren had dozed off on a bench near the forge, lulled by the rhythmic clanging that had become as steady as a heartbeat. When his eyes snapped open, dawnlight was creeping through the windows, and the sound of steel on steel was still ringing through the workshop. He's still going? Ren stumbled to his feet, rubbing his eyes. Jin stood at the anvil, drenched in sweat, his expression carved from stone. The metal beneath his hammer glowed with a light that shouldn't have been possible. Each strike sent sparks spiraling toward the ceiling, like tiny stars being born and dying in the same breath. The old blacksmith watched, transfixed, as Jin plunged the finished piece into the water trough. Steam erupted in a violent hiss, filling the forge with a white cloud, and when Jin lifted the blade free, it gleamed with a light that made Ren's knees buckle. Grade B steel. That's impossible, Ren breathed. He reached grade B without any special abilities. I've never seen anything like it. Jin examined the blade, turning it slowly in the firelight. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling with exhaustion, but the look on his face was one of quiet fury. It wasn't good enough. Not yet. Molten metal poured into the mold, glowing white hot. Jin leaned over his workbench, cursing softly. He'd pushed too far on the last attempt, nearly ruining hours of work. His muscles screamed for rest. His vision swam. Ren appeared at his shoulder, holding a set of tongs. Need a hand? Jin managed a tired smile. Yeah, thanks. They worked side by side in silence for a while. Then Ren spoke, his voice stripped of all its earlier skepticism. You forged a rare grade sword, he said, and the words came out hushed, reverent, in a starter zone, with no special skills. I've been a blacksmith my entire life, and I've never seen anyone do what you just did. Jin said nothing. His eyes were on the blade. It's too early to celebrate, he said quietly. The handle isn't finished, and the edge needs to be sharper, much sharper. Ren stared at him. Then he laughed. A real laugh this time, warm and bewildered. I've never met a stranger kid than you. You forge a blade that would make master craftsmen weep, and you're still not satisfied. I've loved this since I was a child, Jin said simply. My father taught me that good enough is the enemy of great. Ren disappeared for a moment and came back holding something in his palm. A stone, pale green, luminous, with an inner light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Try forging again, Ren said. With this. Jin took the stone. The moment it touched his skin, he felt it. A weight that went beyond the physical. A density that whispered of something ancient and impossibly rare. Is this what I think it is? Mithril, Ren said. Passed down through my family for generations. I've never had the skill to use it properly. Jin's throat tightened. Why would you give me something like this? The old man's eyes were bright. Because I've already learned more watching you work for 2 days than I learned in 20 years on my own, and I want to see what you make with it." He paused. "This task is beyond me, but it's not beyond you." Jin held the mithril in both hands, feeling its warmth seep into his palms. In the real world, a material like this didn't exist. But here, in this forge, in this world, where his arm worked and his father's teachings still lived in his hands, it was real, and it was waiting for him. "I'll do it justice," Jin said, a blacksmith's oath, the only kind that mattered. Ren cleared his throat. "Before you start, I have one request." Jin looked up. "Can I stay and learn?" The old blacksmith's pride cracked right down the middle, and underneath it was something raw and honest. "Can I call you master?" Jin blinked. "You're twice my age." "Age doesn't matter at the anvil," Ren said firmly. "Only skill, and yours is beyond anything I've encountered." Jin didn't know what to say to that. The man who'd been snoring over his own anvil 2 days ago was now asking to be his student. The world had turned upside down, and somehow it felt exactly right. "Stay," Jin said. "Watch, and never stop asking questions." Ren's weathered face split into a grin. A month passed in the forge. Jin worked the mithril with everything he had, folding and refining it, using techniques his father had perfected over a lifetime. The blade that emerged was unlike anything Ren had ever seen. It pulsed with light, humming with contained violence, and when Jin held it up to the firelight, the edge was so fine it seemed to cut the air itself. An epic grade sword, forged by a man who was technically still a beginner. Jin wiped the sweat from his brow and allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. Then he sheathed the blade and turned to face what came next. Somewhere far from the forge, people were watching. In a sleek monitoring center, 2 analysts stood before a wall-sized screen displaying Jin's profile. One of them shook his head slowly. "No matter how many times I see it, it's insane," he said. "How did a player who entered the forge on day 1 manage to craft an epic-grade weapon with mithril?" The woman beside him adjusted her glasses. "We've tracked him down. 23 years old, lives in a 1-room apartment, accessed the game from a friend's place before getting the VIP capsule, and he insists on keeping his personal data confidential? Completely. If his identity leaked, he'd be treated like a celebrity. He clearly doesn't want that." The man leaned back in his chair. He must have his reasons. On the screen, Jin's avatar walked through a sunlit gateway into a training field. A system announcement echoed across the landscape. "From this point forward, real monsters will appear." The hunting field instructor blocked the entrance. A burly man named Renson, arms folded, jaw set. He looked Jin up and down with the kind of contempt reserved for insects. "I can see your level," Renson said flatly. "Level 1. You won't pass the test. Go hunt some rabbits and come back when you've grown up." Jin's expression didn't change. Beneath the calm surface, his mind was already working. This instructor couldn't see his real abilities, couldn't see the hundreds of stat points packed into a frame that technically read as the weakest player in the game, couldn't see the epic-grade sword hanging at his hip, or the armor that reflected damage back at anyone foolish enough to strike him. "Good. I won't waste your time," Jin said. Renson snorted. "Pick any sword from the rack and get moving." Jin walked past the rack without stopping. His hand found the hilt of his own blade, the one he'd forged with his father's techniques, his own sweat, and a month of sleepless nights. "Any sword would do," Renson had said. So Jin chose the best one in the world. The blade cut through the first orc like it was made of paper. Jin hadn't known what to expect from actual combat. He'd trained with wooden dummies. He'd practiced forms until his muscles memorized every angle. But killing a living, breathing, screaming creature that charged at him with murder in its eyes was something else entirely. The orc lunged. Jin sidestepped, brought the sword around in a clean arc, and felt the resistance give way like cloth tearing. The creature dropped, dead, before it hit the ground. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the terrible thrill of discovering that every stat point he'd earned at the anvil, every hour of hammering and folding and refining, had turned his body into something dangerous. A notification flashed. He'd gained experience, and just like that, he wasn't level 1 anymore. 3 more orcs rushed from the tree line. Jin drew his bow, the one he'd crafted from buffalo horn, and let an arrow fly. It hit the lead orc square in the chest and launched the creature 4 meters backward, dead before it landed. That wasn't a weapon, that was a cannon. The subjugation captain, a grizzled soldier named Harlan, had seen a lot of strange things in his years leading the orc cleanup patrols. But the outsider blacksmith, who was single-handedly turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse, was not something he'd prepared for. "Save that outsider!" Harlan bellowed, spurring his horse forward. But by the time his men reached Jin's position, there was nothing left to save him from. Orc bodies littered the ground in a 10-meter radius. Jin stood in the center, breathing hard, his armor gleaming with reflected blood. The soldiers stared. Jin sheathed his sword and looked up. I'm fine. He was more than fine. His armor had a nasty trick built into it. Any creature that struck him had a chance of taking its own damage right back. One orc had punched him in the chest and crumpled like it had hit a wall, its own fist shattered by the reflected force. Then, Jin activated his swordsmanship technique, the one that Varen, the lord whose family bow he'd restored, had taught him out of gratitude. A devastating technique that turned him into a whirlwind of steel, striking everything hostile within 10 meters. 8 orcs died in the span of a single breath. The soldiers watched in stunned silence. Then, Jin raised his sword and shouted, "Nobody dies today. We're all getting out of here alive." The words hit harder than any weapon. Men who'd been retreating found their spines again. Soldiers who'd been counting their last breaths gripped their swords tighter and pushed forward. Something ignited in the ranks. Not hope, something fiercer. The orc warrior appeared when the momentum was at its peak. It was enormous, over 2 meters tall, wrapped in black plate armor that gleamed like obsidian, with a horned helmet that made it look like a demon pulled straight from a nightmare. It carried a greatsword that was taller than most men, and when it brought it down, the impact cratered the earth. Harlan charged it. His sword bounced off the armor like a stick striking a boulder. He attacked again and again, targeting the same spot, trying to find a weakness. Sparks flew. The armor held. "It can't be pierced," Harlan gasped, blood running from a gash on his forehead. The orc warrior caught him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Harlan choked, kicking, his sword arm pinned. Behind him, a second orc warrior emerged from the trees. 2 of them. The subjugation force had never survived even one. A soldier named Bram sprinted to Jin, blood in his eyes and death in his voice. "We'll clear a path. Please, help the captain. Kill that thing." Jin looked at the orc warrior's armor. He knew metal. He knew what could be cut and what couldn't. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that his sword wouldn't scratch that plate. But he also knew something else. He was a blacksmith. And blacksmiths don't just swing weapons. They make them. 1 minute, Jin said. "Give me 1 minute." He dropped to one knee and pulled a length of bamboo from the undergrowth. His hands moved with terrifying speed, shaping, carving, fitting. A special arrow, not a full-size shaft, something smaller, thinner, designed for a single purpose. The technique was ancient, a penetration arrow, lightweight and impossibly fast, built to punch through armor that full-sized arrows would bounce off. Jin's father had told him about it once, during one of those long nights in the workshop, when the old man would talk about the history of weapons while they both hammered away at steel. Jin fitted the arrow to his bow, drew. His arms were steady, his breath was still. Across the field, the first orc warrior had Harlan pinned against a tree, its greatsword raised for the killing blow. Harlan looked up through swollen eyes and saw something he would never forget. A streak of light, silent, blindingly fast. The arrow punched through the orc warrior's horned helmet like it was made of tin. The creature froze, swayed, and collapsed forward like a felled tree, dead before its body finished falling. Harlan slid down the trunk, gasping, staring at the arrow shaft protruding from the monster's skull. Jin was already knocking the second arrow. The second orc warrior roared and charged. Jin drew, adjusted for distance and wind, and released. The arrow screamed across the gap and buried itself in the creature's throat, dropping it mid-stride. It skidded across the dirt and went still. The battlefield fell silent. Then the remaining orcs broke and ran, squealing in panic, tripping over each other in their desperation to flee. Harlan's voice cracked across the field like a whip. "Chase them down! Every last one!" When it was over, the soldiers gathered around Jin in a loose circle. Nobody spoke for a long time. Harlan limped forward and dropped to one knee. "You are the hero of this force," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every soldier he'd lost in years of fighting these patrols. "Every man here owes you his life." He placed his hand over his heart and spoke words that carried an ancient power, a blessing, the kind that could only be given once in a lifetime by a commander who truly meant it. Jin felt it settle over him like warm rain, filling his veins, sharpening his senses. Bram stepped forward next, eyes still red, still burning. "When I first heard you were a blacksmith, I thought you'd be dead in 5 minutes. His voice broke. "I've never been happier to be wrong." Jin nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Something was building in his chest that felt too big for words. He turned and began the long walk back to the tower. The blacksmith's tower rose from the landscape like a stone fist thrust toward the sky. Inside, the tower masters were arguing. "This is outrageous." The master of the bow forge, a man named Corvin, slammed his hand on the table. "You gave an outsider a trial that requires 70% contribution in an orc subjugation? The standard is 10%. You've set him up to fail. Darren, the master of the sword forge, sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed. He was the one who had set the trial, the one who had watched Jin split the talent stone clean in half, and decided in that moment that this outsider might be something the world hadn't seen in centuries. "You know what the god of blacksmiths was, don't you?" Darren said calmly. "Not just a craftsman, a warrior, the strongest being on the continent. He forged a single sword and used it to defeat anyone who stood against him. If his successor is going to walk that path, he needs to be more than a man who swings a hammer." Corvin's face reddened. "We are blacksmiths, Darren, not soldiers." The god of blacksmiths was both. Silence fell over the room. The other masters shifted uncomfortably. Then the door opened and a young voice spoke. "I'm back." Jin stood in the doorway, travel-worn and still carrying the dust of the battlefield. The tower masters stared. Darren rose slowly from his seat. 92% contribution, Darren said, reading the report that had arrived moments before. 2 orc warriors killed, 0 allied casualties. The room went dead silent. Corvin's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Darren allowed himself a smile, just a small one. "Follow me," he told Jin. "There's one more thing you need to do." He led Jin to the top floor of the tower, to a chamber that hadn't been opened in 30 years. Inside, the air was thick with something that wasn't dust. It was presence, weight, the feeling of standing in a place where something divine had once rested. In the center of the room, embedded in a stone pedestal, was a sword. It was plain, unadorned, the kind of blade that could have been made by any village blacksmith. But the moment Jin stepped into the chamber, it began to shake. The pedestal cracked, the stone floor trembled, and the sword wrenched itself free, rising into the air, spinning once, and then stopping, hovering in front of Jin's chest as if it had been waiting for him since the moment it was forged. He could feel it, not just the weight of the metal, the will behind it. This blade had been made by a god, and it was choosing him. Jin reached out and closed his hand around the hilt. Light exploded through the chamber. It poured from the sword, from the walls, from Jin himself, filling the room with a radiance so intense that the tower masters shielded their eyes. In that blinding eruption, something ancient and vast recognized something small and determined, and found them worthy. When the light faded, Jin stood alone in the chamber, the sword in his hand, a new title burning in his mind like a brand. Descendant of Aska, God class. He felt the power settle into his bones. Every stat surged, every skill sharpened. The mastery he'd built through weeks of relentless work at the anvil doubled, tripled, expanded in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He wasn't just a blacksmith anymore. He was the heir to a legacy that predated kingdoms. The sword hummed in his grip, satisfied. He walked out of the chamber and into a storm. Corvin was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The Bowforge master's expression had shifted from disbelief to something colder, hungrier. "Congratulations, descendant of the god of blacksmiths," Corvin said, and the words dripped with false warmth. "Allow me to be the first to offer you a position. Vice Master of the Bowforge. You'll command 500 blacksmiths, earn 50,000 gold a year, and hold the title of Baron." It was an enormous offer. Wealth, power, influence, everything a new player could dream of. Jin looked at Corvin for a long moment. He saw the greed behind the smile, saw the calculation in those sharp eyes. This man didn't want a partner. He wanted a weapon he could point at his enemies. "No," Jin said. Corvin blinked. "I'm sorry? I won't serve under anyone's command. I'd appreciate it if you didn't make the offer again." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Behind them, Darren burst into laughter. Wild, ringing, joyous laughter that echoed through the entire tower. "A tiger cub!" he howled, slapping his knee. "You tried to cage a tiger cub, Corvin, and you're surprised it bit your hand?" Corvin's face went white, then red, then something beyond red, a shade that belonged to humiliation and rage in equal measure. "You'll regret that," Corvin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think you can survive in the blacksmith world without backing? Without a tower behind you?" Jin turned to face him fully. "I think blacksmithing should be proven through skill, not politics." The words landed like a slap. Every tower master in the room flinched. Corvin's jaw tightened. "Then prove it. A blacksmith duel. You and me. We forge swords from identical materials. Then we clash them. 3 strikes. If your blade causes even 5% damage to mine, you win." The other masters exchanged glances. Corvin was the Bowforge master, with centuries of experience and a mastery level that bordered on legendary. Challenging him was suicide. Jin should have hesitated, should have calculated the odds, weighed the risks, considered a strategic retreat. Instead, he smiled. "What do I get when I win?" Corvin's eye twitched. 5,000 gold and my legendary bowcrafting method. "And if I lose? You work in my forge for 1 month, under my command." Jin looked at the hammer in his hand, thought about what he could do with it now, thought about the skill that burned inside him, the one he'd earned by forging a blade so perfect that a god's weapon had chosen him for it. Deal, he said. The other tower masters watched in horror. One of them grabbed Jin's arm. Are you insane? Corvin has been forging for over 300 years. His artifacts are unique grade. You're throwing your career away. Darren stepped close and spoke quietly, so only Jin could hear. It was reckless. Why did you accept? Jin met his eyes. Because I know what my hands can do. Darren studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly. Then show them. They moved to the forging floor. Twin anvils, identical materials, presented as holograms that would become real the moment they were shaped. Corvin was already at his station, hammering with the confidence of a man who had never lost. Jin stood at his anvil and closed his eyes. He reached inside himself, past the fear, past the doubt, and found the skill that had been born when the god of blacksmiths recognized him. Divine crafting. He didn't need to make a stronger sword. He didn't need to match Corvin's grade or his experience. He needed to make a sword that did one thing, and did it perfectly. Cut through other swords. The cost was steep. To forge a blade with that single devastating ability, he had to sacrifice everything else. Attack power, durability, all of it, poured into one purpose. The result would be a blade that looked ordinary, felt ordinary, and would be dismissed by anyone who judged weapons by their grade. But in the moment of contact, it would be the deadliest thing in the room. Jin opened his eyes and began to forge. Corvin finished first. He held up his creation with a grin that split his face. The other tower masters gasped. Unique grade, a pitch-black blade called Dark Knight, with a passive ability that shattered enemy weapons on contact. It was, by every measurable standard, a masterpiece. One of the masters used an appraisal ability on Jin's sword. Rare grade, he reported, and the pity in his voice was almost tangible. It's over, Corvin laughed. You see, the difference between us is heaven and earth. I'll give you one last chance. Surrender now, come work under me, and I'll pretend this embarrassment never happened. Jin said nothing. He lifted his sword and walked to the center of the floor. Darren stood between them, arms raised. 3 clashes. Begin. First clash. The swords met with a sound like thunder. Corvin's blade pulsed with dark energy, and Jin felt his own weapon shudder. A crack ran along the edge. 18% of its durability, gone in a single hit. The tower masters nodded. Expected. Second clash. Another impact. Another tremor. Jin's sword lost 16% more. Corvin was grinning, already tasting victory, already planning where he'd put his new trophy blacksmith. Third clash. Jin swung, not harder, not faster, just differently. The angle shifted, his wrist turned, and the blade erupted in white light. It was the light of something divine, something that didn't care about grades or experience or centuries of tradition, something that cared only about the truth of the metal, the purity of the forge, and the will of the hand that held it. The swords connected. Corvin's Dark Knight shattered, not cracked, not chipped, shattered. The blade split clean through, the pieces spinning away across the stone floor, ringing like broken bells. 99% damage in a single strike. The room went silent, not the silence of shock, the silence of the world rearranging itself around a new reality. Jin sheathed his sword and turned away. Over his shoulder, he said, "Swords are not determined by grade alone." Corvin stood frozen, staring at the broken halves of his masterpiece. His hands trembled, his mouth worked soundlessly. Then something unexpected happened. The rage drained from his face, and what replaced it was older, softer, and far more honest. He remembered something, a boy, young and bright-eyed, watching his father hammer steel in a tiny village forge. A boy who had looked at a finished blade and thought, with all the certainty of youth, someday I'll make something that changes the world. He'd forgotten that boy, buried him under centuries of politics, rivalry, and the slow poison of caring more about rank than craft. Jin's blade had cut through more than steel. It had cut through everything Corvin had built around himself to avoid remembering who he'd wanted to be. His knees hit the floor. "Can I make weapons like that?" Corvin whispered, and his voice was stripped bare. No pride, no venom, just a man kneeling before the truth. Jin looked down at him. "That's something you'll have to answer for yourself." Corvin bowed his head. When he raised it, his eyes were clear. "The legendary bowcrafting method is yours," he said. "You've earned it." Darren stood in the shadows, watching the whole thing with a smile he couldn't have hidden if he'd tried. He'd waited a long time for this. The myth said that the god of blacksmiths would one day return and lead all who worked the forge. Watching an outsider with scarred memories and borrowed time bring a 300-year-old master to his knees with nothing but a rare-grade sword and an unshakable belief in his craft was the closest thing to proof Darren had ever seen. The legend was just getting started. Jin collected his reward, tucked the crafting method into his inventory, and walked out of the tower into the sunlight. Behind him, the hammer of a god hung at his belt. Ahead of him, the whole world waited to be forged. The sunlight felt different on this side of the tower. Jin walked through the gate with the legendary bow crafting method tucked safely in his inventory and 5,000 gold, heavier than when he'd entered. Behind him, the blacksmith's tower stood tall and quiet, as if it hadn't just witnessed the impossible. But the world outside didn't care about what had happened in that forging hall. The world outside had bills, and Jin's father was still lying in a hospital bed, breathing through a machine, waiting for a miracle that cost more money than Jin had ever seen in his life. He logged out of Aegis and sat in the dim glow of his monitor, doing the math. 5,000 gold was 5 million won, enough to cover a couple months of hospital fees, but not enough for the thing that mattered most. A new treatment, 10 million won per month. Experimental, cutting edge, no side effects. The kind of medicine that could pull a man out of a vegetative state and bring him back to the world of the living. His father could wake up. Jin stared at the ceiling and let that thought settle. Then he opened the auction house. He listed 2 items: the Orc Warrior's greatsword, a solid piece, but nothing special, and the sword he'd forged for the duel against Corvin, the one with the ability to cut through other blades. It had 17 uses left, and to most people scrolling past, it would look like garbage. Low attack power, modest durability, a rare grade weapon in a world where everyone chased legendaries. But someone out there would understand. It took less than an hour. The Aegis community forums erupted first. A player stumbled onto the listing and posted about it, half mocking, half confused. The comments piled up fast. Trash stats, waste of gold, who would buy this? Then, a veteran player, someone ranked in the top 10,000, broke it down. He explained the sword cutting ability, how it could be swapped mid-fight and to shatter an opponent's weapon, how it was a hard counter to any NPC boss who relied on a single devastating blade. The price started climbing. 2,000 gold, 5,000, 10,000. Across the country, a man named Soren was throwing things at his wall. Soren was ranked 21st on the national leaderboard. He was talented, disciplined, and stuck. For months, he'd been grinding toward a single goal, a legendary class change that required him to land 11 clean hits on Sword King Draven, one of the 10 great legends of Aegis. Draven was the king of Valdris, a nation built on swordsmanship, and he fought like a natural disaster. Soren had challenged him 3 times, failed 3 times. Each attempt cost him resources, pride, and a little more of his sanity. When a guildmate called him about a strange sword on the auction house, Soren almost didn't pick up. But something in the description caught his eye. A blade that could cut through other blades. He bid 53,000 gold, won it. Then he went back to Draven. The Sword King looked down at him with open contempt. "You've returned, with an even more pathetic weapon than before." Soren said nothing. He drew the sword and charged. On the 4th clash, the blade activated. A flash of white light, a sound like glass shattering, and Draven's legendary weapon cracked clean in half. The Sword King staggered. His power dropped by a quarter in an instant. His balance destroyed. His rhythm broken. Soren didn't hesitate. He pressed the attack. 1 hit. 3, 7, 11. The notification exploded across his screen. Quest complete. Class change. Heir of the Sword King. Legendary. Soren collapsed to his knees, shaking, laughing, crying. Months of failure, erased by a single weapon forged by a blacksmith he'd never met. Draven rose slowly, his broken sword dangling at his side. But instead of rage, there was something else in his eyes. Fascination, hunger. "Who made this weapon?" Draven said. "I want to meet the blacksmith." The auction results hit Jin's account like a thunderbolt. 53 million won. He sat in his chair for a full minute, not moving, not breathing. Then he grabbed his jacket and left for the hospital. The nurse at the front desk looked up when he walked in. She was used to seeing him, the tall young man with burn scars across half his face, who visited every week and always looked like the weight of the world was crushing him. Today, something was different. He stood a little straighter. His voice was a little steadier. "I'd like to prepay 2 months of hospital bills," Jin said, "and I want to start the new treatment. And if possible, I'd like to move my father to a private room." The nurse blinked. Then she processed the payment. On the way out, Jin passed the doctor, an older man who'd been treating his father for years. The doctor stopped him in the hallway. "You're really going ahead with it?" "Yes." The doctor hesitated, then smiled. "I hope it works, Jin. I really do." Jin nodded and walked out into the cold air. For the first time in years, the future felt like something other than a countdown to disaster. Back in Aegis, the aftershock of the auction had changed everything. Soren posted a review of Jin's forge, detailed, passionate, and read by hundreds of thousands of players within hours. Jin's subscriber count exploded, 3,000 to 15,000, 15,000 to 30,000. The numbers kept climbing. Then, Soren sent him a private message. The message was simple, grateful, almost reverent, and at the end, a warning. Sword King Draven wants to meet you. He wants a sword crafted by your hand. He's obsessed with it. I've never seen an NPC that hungry for anything. Jin stared at the message. Draven was one of the 10 legends of Aegis, a king, a monster in human form. Meeting him normally required being at least level 200. Jin was nowhere close, but there was another way. The Super Rookie Tournament, a competition for players between levels 50 and 60. The winner earned a brief audience with the Sword King. Jin filed that away. First, there was something else he needed to do. Meanwhile, in the real world, a man named Gideon stood in front of a demolished building, his hands in his coat pockets. The building had been a blacksmith's forge once, Jin's father's forge. Gideon had bought it when Jin was forced to sell, and he'd promised, in a moment of unexpected kindness, to sell it back at the same price if Jin could raise the money within a month. The month was ticking down, 330 million won. That was the price of a dead man's dream. Jin logged back into Aegis with a plan. Darren, the sword forge master, had told him about a place called Thornwall Territory before they parted ways, a frontier settlement under siege by the undead, with a lord who possessed rare ore that Jin would need for future crafting. He traveled there by warp. The moment he materialized outside the territory walls, an arrow screamed past his head. Jin's hand snapped up and deflected it. Reflex. Pure muscle memory from weeks of combat training. A centurion named Radek rushed toward him, eyes wide. "Outsider, are you insane standing in the open? The undead are everywhere." "I was told to come here," Jin said calmly, "by Master Darren." That name carried weight. Radek straightened up and led Jin inside the walls. The territory was a fortress under slow collapse. The undead had been pushing closer every week since the Bell of Solace, a sacred artifact that weakened the dead, had shattered beyond repair. Without it, the undead were relentless. The walls were holding, barely. Radek brought Jin to the Knight Commander, a grizzled man named Aldrich, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "A blacksmith," Aldrich said flatly, looking at Jin's level. "Level 40, sent by Darren." His jaw tightened. "Every blacksmith who's come here has failed. The bell can't be repaired. The system itself says so." "I'd like to examine it," Jin said. "Kill 10 ghouls first, then we'll talk." Ghouls were 3 times stronger than the skeletons and zombies that made up the bulk of the undead horde. For a player at Jin's level, the quest was supposed to be a death sentence. Aldrich was trying to make him leave quietly. Jin looked out over the wall at the shambling mass of corpses below. Dozens of them, hundreds. Their screams rose like a chorus of rusted metal. 20 gold per ghoul? Jin asked. Aldrich raised an eyebrow. "If you can kill them." "Deal." Jin knocked an arrow and let it fly from the castle wall. It punched through the first ghoul's skull and buried itself in the one behind it. Both dropped. Radek's mouth fell open. Jin switched to his sword and activated his combat skills. He moved through the undead like a scythe through wheat, each strike precise, each step calculated. The ghouls were strong, but they were slow, and Jin had spent weeks under a swordsmanship master who'd beaten technique into his bones through sheer repetition. He killed 10, then 20, then 30. The system noticed. A notification flashed. A new episode had triggered. Special rewards from Knight Commander Aldrich awaited upon completion. Jin tied a rope to the battlement and dropped over the wall, landing among the undead. They swarmed him. He activated every skill he had. Attack speed doubled. Critical strikes found weak points that shattered bone and sinew. When they surrounded him completely, he unleashed a whirlwind slash that cut everything within 10 meters to pieces. By the time the dust settled, he'd gained 7 levels and earned a new title. The soldiers on the wall watched in disbelief. Then the ground shook. A giant ghoul emerged from the horde, nearly 3 meters tall, built like a siege engine, its eyes burning with a crimson light that made the regular undead look like puppets. It was almost twice Jin's level, and it was heading straight for him. An emergency quest appeared. Kill it for 1,000 gold. Fail, and he'd be permanently locked out of territory battles. Jin's instincts screamed at him to run. His greed told him to stay. He stayed. The giant ghoul hit like a landslide. Its first swing sent Jin skidding across the dirt, his health dropping to dangerous levels. The second nearly killed him. His armor absorbed what it could, but the creature was simply too powerful. Each hit drained his speed, his attack power, his ability to fight back. His health dropped below 30%, then below 10. This is where most players would have logged out, accepted the loss, lived to fight another day. But Jin felt something stir inside him, a warmth in his hands, a pulse from the god-class power that lived in his bones. And then, a notification he'd never seen before. New skill unlocked. Divine emergency crafting. Craft a weapon in 20 seconds. The weapon lasts 30 seconds before it vanishes. 20 seconds to forge, 30 seconds to kill. Jin's mind went blank, and then it went faster than it had ever gone before. He pulled up the crafting interface and started building. Not a standard weapon, something specific, something from his father's world, from the old traditions, from a knowledge that no game system could replicate. A royal sword, an ancient blade forged to repel evil spirits, to burn the unholy, to cut through darkness itself. He wasn't a church blacksmith. The system told him he couldn't do it. Jin ignored the system. 7 seconds. Materials selected, smelted, shaped. The divine crafting skill burned through the process like wildfire, translating his real-world knowledge into something the game had never seen. The sword materialized in his hand. White light poured from the blade, so bright it hurt to look at. The air hummed. The ground trembled. Jin charged. The giant ghoul swung. Jin ducked under its fist, planted his feet, and drove the royal sword upward with everything he had. The blade sank into the creature's chest, and the divine light erupted outward, burning through dead flesh and cursed bone like sunlight through fog. The ghoul screamed once, then it turned to ash. The royal sword held its shape for 3 more seconds. Then it flickered, shimmered, and vanished from Jin's hand like smoke. 30 seconds, not a moment more. Jin stared at his empty palm, the most beautiful weapon he had ever forged, gone before he could even admire it. Someday, he told himself, someday I'll make a real one. Knight Commander Aldrich arrived at a dead sprint, Radek beside him, both of them skidding to a halt when they saw what was left of the battlefield. Ash, craters, and Jin standing in the middle of it, breathing hard, alive. Aldrich dropped to one knee, not out of ceremony, out of genuine respect. "I was wrong about you," Aldrich said. "I treated you like every other outsider who came through here making promises. You're different." He placed 2,000 gold into Jin's hand and looked him in the eye. "Please, look at the Bell of Solace. You're the last hope this territory has." Jin accepted the quest. 30,000 gold if he could repair the bell. Enough, combined with what he'd already earned, to start closing the gap on his father's forge. But first, he needed to see what he was working with. What he found was worse than he'd expected. The Bell of Solace wasn't cracked. It wasn't chipped. It was shattered into dozens of fragments, scattered across a stone floor like broken pottery. Every blacksmith who'd tried to repair it had walked away shaking their heads. The system classified it as unrepairable. End of story. A woman was already there when Jin arrived. She stood over the fragments with her arms crossed and fire in her eyes. Her name was Layra, an advanced blacksmith from the Iron Vanguard Guild, and she had spent weeks trying to save this territory. She'd failed, and she wasn't happy about a stranger walking in to try again. "If you're here to scam these people," Lyra said coldly, "I won't let it happen." Jin didn't answer. He knelt beside the fragments and picked one up, turned it over, tapped it with a hammer. Lyra lunged forward. "What are you doing? You can't just smash the pieces." Jin hit it again, harder. The fragment broke in half, and a faint glow pulsed from the inside. There it was, the divine power, still living in the material, even after the bell had been destroyed. "You can't repair something that's been shattered this badly," Jin said quietly, "so I won't repair it." Lyra stared at him. "I'll melt it down and forge a new one." The territory alarm screamed before Lyra could respond. Undead. A full-scale invasion pouring out of the wasteland like a black tide. The walls shook. Soldiers scrambled to their positions. Women and children ran for the shelters. Aldrich declared a state of emergency. Every able body to the walls. Every weapon drawn. In the Lord's chambers, Lord Tarek sat alone, drinking from a bottle with trembling hands. Aldrich found him there. "My lord, we should evacuate." Tarek shook his head. "I won't run. This territory is everything I built. If it falls, I fall with it." He took another drink. "The bell can't be fixed. We both know that." Aldrich said nothing, but somewhere behind his eyes, a small flame of hope still burned. The outsider blacksmith with the impossible skills. The man who had forged divine light from thin air and killed a giant ghoul with a weapon that lasted 30 seconds. If anyone could do the impossible, it was him. Jin walked into the territory's forge and closed the door behind him. Outside, the undead hammered against the walls. Inside, the furnace waited. He laid out every fragment of the Bell of Solace, drew a blueprint from memory, one his father had shown him years ago when they'd studied the great bells of history together. Then, he fired up the forge and began to melt the sacred metal. Lyra found him 2 hours later, drawn by the sound of hammering. She stood in the doorway, watching him work. His technique was nothing like the automated crafting that every player used in Aegis. There were no robotic movements, No system-assisted swings. Every strike was human, deliberate, alive. She'd been a blacksmith for years, reached advanced level, studied under masters, and she had never, in all that time, seen anyone craft like this. "You're handcrafting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody handcrafts anymore." Jin didn't look up. "My father did. His father before him. It's the only way I know." Lyra watched him fold the metal, refine it, shape it with bare hands and raw skill. The system registered what she was seeing and corrected itself. The notification that appeared on her screen made her knees weak. "You are witnessing the work of a master craftsman." He was level 40. Master craftsmen were level 300 and above. And yet the system itself couldn't deny what her eyes were telling her. "How long are you going to stand there?" Jin said, without turning around. "I need help. You care about this territory, don't you?" Lyra's throat tightened. She'd spent weeks feeling helpless, watching the walls crumble, watching people lose hope. And now this stranger, this impossible, infuriating stranger, was asking her to help him do what every expert in the game said couldn't be done. She rolled up her sleeves and stepped into the forge. "Tell me what to do." Jin handed her a pair of tongs. Outside, the dead clawed at the gates. Inside, two blacksmiths began to forge something that wasn't supposed to exist. The bell wouldn't just be repaired, it would be reborn, and the divine power humming in the molten metal seemed to agree, glowing brighter with every strike, as if it had been waiting all along for hands skilled enough to set it free. They worked through the night without speaking. Jin struck the molten metal in steady rhythm, while Lyra fed the forge, adjusted the temperature, held the molds in place. The divine power trapped inside the old fragments bled into the new shape, like light dissolving into water. Every strike pulled more of it free. Every fold compressed it, tighter, denser, brighter. 2 hours became 10. 10 became 20. The undead outside never stopped. Their howls bled through the walls like a storm that refused to pass. Lyra watched Jin's hands move and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd been a blacksmith for years. She had trained under the best the Iron Vanguard Guild could offer. And yet, the man standing across from her, drenched in sweat, his burn-scarred face lit orange by the forge, was operating on a level she had never imagined existed. No automated systems, no game-assisted precision, just raw, human skill poured into every movement. A notification blinked in the corner of her vision. She had earned a proficiency increase just from watching him work. "You haven't slept," she said. Jin didn't look up. "Neither have you." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He was right, and somehow that made her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 4 days passed. Jin did not sleep, not once. He barely ate. Lyra brought him water, and he drank without stopping his work. She held sheets of heated metal while he hammered them into shape. She mixed alloys while he tested resonance by tapping the forming bell with his knuckle, listening for a frequency only he could hear. On the second day, the undead breached the outer wall. Soldiers fell back to the inner perimeter. The screaming grew louder. On the third day, Lyra checked Jin's crafting interface over his shoulder and saw something that made her breath catch. The completion rate was already past 80%. The artifact was registering as unique grade, not epic, like the original Bell of Solace, higher. She thought about everything she knew about blacksmithing in Aegis, about the rankings, the levels, the hard limits that separated good craftsmen from great ones. Master craftsman status required level 300. Jin was level 40. The system had already told her the truth. She just hadn't been ready to believe it. "You're the one who broke the wooden dummy," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jin's hammer paused for half a second. Then it fell again. That was all the answer she needed. Somewhere far from Thornwall territory, in an office that existed outside the game entirely, two developers stared at their monitors with identical expressions of disbelief. The story team leader leaned back in his chair. "You're telling me we might have to scrap the territorial fall update?" The special user management lead nodded slowly. "The bell he's building is superior to the original in every measurable way. If it activates, the undead scenario collapses. The whole narrative we planned for that region becomes irrelevant." "That's impossible. The Bell of Solace was classified as unrepairable." "He didn't repair it. He melted it down and built something new." Silence stretched between them. The story team leader rubbed his temples. "Who is this guy?" The management lead pulled up a profile. Level 40, blacksmith class. No guild affiliation. A subscriber count that had recently exploded past 100,000. "He's the same user who broke the wooden dummy during the tutorial." The story team leader let out a long, slow breath. "Of course he is." On the morning of the 5th day, Jin set down his hammer. The bell stood on its mount in the center of the forge, gleaming with a pale golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was smaller than the original Bell of Solace, but denser, heavier with purpose. Jin had carved his mark into the metal, a single character that meant everything to him and nothing to anyone else. Lyra checked the stats, and her hands began to tremble. Unique grade, indestructible, a weakening aura that would cripple every undead creature within range. And buried inside it, an active skill called 100 Flowers Flame, a devastating blast of divine fire that could drain most of a target's life force in a single activation and freeze them in place. It wasn't just better than the old bell, it was a weapon. "I want you," Lyra whispered. Her voice cracked on the words. Not desire for the man, desire for the craft, for the impossible thing he had just pulled from fire and faith and 4 sleepless days. "I want you so desperately." Jin wiped the soot from his face. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, like a man who had poured every drop of himself into a single creation and had nothing left. Then the ground shook. The Death Lord arrived at the gates of Thornwall territory like a plague given legs. He was massive, taller than any undead they had faced. His robes hung in tatters around a body of rotting muscle and ancient bone, and the sword in his hand radiated a cold so deep it froze the air around it. The regular undead parted before him like water around a stone. Knight Commander Aldrich met him at the wall. It was never a fair fight. Aldrich was injured, exhausted, fighting left-handed because his right arm had been shattered 2 days ago. But he planted himself between the Death Lord and his people, and he refused to move. "I will not hand over this territory," Aldrich said through gritted teeth, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Not while I still breathe." The Death Lord swung his sword like an executioner. Aldrich blocked it. The impact drove him to his knees, cracked the stone beneath his boots, and sent a shockwave rippling across the battlefield. Aldrich's health dropped to critical. One more hit would end him. Then the bell rang. The sound rolled across the territory like a wave of sunlight. It hit the undead first. Every corpse, every skeleton, every shambling horror that had been clawing at the walls suddenly staggered, weakened, diminished. Their movements slowed. Their attacks lost force. The soldiers on the wall felt the opposite. Strength flooding back into tired limbs. Hope replacing despair. Jin stood at the top of the castle wall, one hand on the bell's rope, his body swaying with exhaustion. The Death Lord screamed. The sound that poured from the bell burned him from the inside. He turned his hollow eyes toward the wall, found the source, and raised his hand. Dead's wish, a killing curse, a skill designed to destroy artifacts and the fools who wielded them. The dark energy slammed into the bell like a battering ram. The impact shook the entire wall. Lyra screamed. Nothing happened. The bell didn't crack, didn't chip, didn't even vibrate. Infinite durability meant infinite durability. The Death Lord's most devastating attack bounced off Jin's creation like rain off a mountain. Jin's eyes were barely open. His body was shutting down. A week without sleep, in the game and in reality, had pushed him past every human limit. But his hand found the bell one more time. "Get lost," he whispered. He activated 100 Flowers Flame. White fire erupted from the bell in every direction. It tore across the battlefield like divine judgment, and when it hit the Death Lord, the effect was catastrophic. 70% of his life force stripped away in an instant. His body convulsed. His sword fell from his grip. He staggered, stunned, unable to move for 3 agonizing seconds. Aldrich saw the opening. The Knight Commander dragged himself to his feet, raised his blade with his one good arm, and charged. Every ounce of strength the bell had given him, every point of attack power it had amplified, went into that single strike. The sword cleaved through the Death Lord's body from shoulder to hip, but the creature did not die. 1%. A sliver of cursed life clung to him, like a parasite refusing to let go. The Death Lord's eyes flickered with something almost like relief. He turned to flee. Jin was already there. He stood at the base of the wall, a bow in his trembling hands. The Orichalcon-tipped arrow knocked and drawn. The white flame still danced along the arrowhead. It's not over yet. The arrow flew. It struck the Death Lord between the eyes, and the divine fire consumed what was left of him. His body didn't collapse. It simply ceased to exist, burned away like paper in a furnace, leaving nothing behind but ash and silence. Jin's vision blurred. His legs buckled. The bow slipped from his fingers. Lyra caught him before he hit the ground. She was shouting something, but the words sounded far away, like someone calling from the other side of a river. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the bell, still glowing on the wall above, its divine light pulsing steady and calm, as if it had always been there, as if it would always be there. He had not slept in 7 days. His body decided that was enough. Jin woke to sunlight and silence. The notifications hit him like an avalanche. Level 50, new stats, new titles, 300 fame, 50 charisma, benefactor of Thornwall territory, a 30% discount on all goods within the territory's borders. He blinked at the ceiling and tried to piece together what had happened after he collapsed. The territory had survived. The undead were gone. The Death Lord was dead. And somewhere in the wreckage, a bell he had forged from scraps and stubbornness was ringing every morning, keeping the land safe, making crops grow faster, giving people a reason to stay. Aldrich visited him that afternoon. The Knight Commander walked in with a wooden box and set it on the table beside Jin's bed. "From Lord Tarek," Aldrich said. He wanted to bring it himself, but he couldn't stop crying long enough to walk down the hall. Jin opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a chunk of ore that glowed with an inner light so pure it made his breath catch. Orichalcon, legendary grade, the rarest forging material on the continent. He said it's been sitting in storage for hundreds of years, Aldrich continued. No one here could ever use it. He wants you to have it. Jin lifted the ore carefully, turning it in his hands. Even at its lowest grade, the properties were staggering. Infinite durability, massive boosts to cutting power, penetration, speed, a material that required a master-level blacksmith just to smelt, a material his father would have given anything to work with. "Thank you," Jin said quietly. "Tell Lord Tarek I said thank you." Aldrich nodded, then he paused at the door. There is also the matter of payment for the bell. The negotiation was brief. An administrator named Corwin had tried to lowball the compensation, arguing that the bell's materials had originally belonged to the territory, and therefore the finished product should be valued at a fraction of its worth. Lord Tarek had walked into that meeting and shut it down with a single sentence that made Corwin turn white as paper. Aldrich tore up the original offer and drafted a new one, 250,000 gold, fair market value for a unique grade wide area artifact with infinite durability. Jin also received 78,000 gold from the loot dropped by the Death Lord. Combined with his existing savings, he was looking at a fortune, but it was what came next that changed everything. Lyra sat across from him in the forge, where they had spent 4 days building the impossible. She looked tired, determined, like someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to unmake it. "The Iron Vanguard Guild has assessed your value," she said. "They're offering an annual contract of 1.2 billion won." Jin looked at her for a long moment. "I have to decline." Lyra nodded. She didn't look surprised. "I thought you'd say that. I'm going to build my own forge, my own guild. I don't want to work under someone else's name." Lyra leaned forward. Her eyes were steady, clear, burning with a quiet intensity that reminded him of the forge fire. "Then, I'm leaving the Iron Vanguard." Jin blinked. "I want to be your first guild member," Lyra said. "I'll support you. I'll handle the business side, the recruitment, the politics, all of it. You just forge." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, Jin exhaled slowly. "You're serious? I watched you build a god-class bell from rubble while the world was ending outside. I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Jin logged out of Aegis and made a phone call. Gideon picked up on the second ring, the real estate developer, the man who owned his father's land. "I have the money," Jin said. "All of it. 330 million won." There was a pause on the other end. Then Gideon laughed, a warm surprise sound. "You actually did it. Can we meet today?" They met at a cafe downtown. Gideon arrived in a tailored coat, looking every bit the billionaire he was. Jin arrived in a hoodie with soot under his fingernails and burn scars across half his face. They signed the papers in 15 minutes. Gideon pushed the deed across the table and watched Jin pick it up with hands that were shaking. "Why did you give me that chance?" Jin asked. "You could have developed the land months ago. It's worth 10 times what I'm paying you." Gideon studied him for a moment. His expression softened. "Because when I met you, I saw a young man who wanted to die, and I wanted you to live." Jin's throat tightened. He looked down at the deed, his father's forge, the land where he had grown up, where he had learned to hold a hammer, where everything had started before the fire took it all away. "I will live," Jin said. "More than anyone, better than anyone. I'll make something magnificent out of this." Gideon smiled and raised his coffee cup. "I believe you." On his way out, Jin stopped and turned back. "Do you play Aegis?" Something flickered in Gideon's eyes, a glint that lasted less than a second before his expression returned to neutral. "Why do you ask?" "If you ever do, let me know. I'll craft something special for you." Gideon chuckled. "I might take you up on that." Jin logged back into Aegis that evening. Lord Tarek was waiting for him in the Great Hall. The old lord looked different now, sober, standing straight, his eyes clear for the first time since Jin had arrived at Thornwall. "I have a question," Tarek said. Why did you work so hard? You didn't sleep for a week. You nearly killed yourself. For a territory that isn't yours. For people you'd never met. Jin thought about it for a moment. Because the territory needed it, he said simply. Tarek studied him, the way a man studies something he doesn't fully understand, but deeply respects. I had planned to give you a different reward, something modest, appropriate for the task. He held out a small chest, but a man who nearly dies for strangers deserves more than what is appropriate. Jin opened the chest. Inside was the orichalcon, not the small sample he had already received, but a larger piece, enough to forge something real, something that could change the game. You are a master craftsman, Tarek said, the first one I've ever met who deserves the title. While Jin slept off his exhaustion, the world moved without him. His subscriber count climbed past 100,000. The Aegis community forums erupted with speculation. Someone had confirmed the bell was real, that it was unique grade, that it had been forged by a level 40 blacksmith who had single-handedly prevented a territorial collapse. Most people didn't believe it, a few did. The ones who did started watching very closely. In a castle far to the west, in the heart of the kingdom of Valdris, Sword King Draven sat on his throne and listened to a report about a blacksmith who had repaired the unrepairable. Draven's eyes narrowed. His broken sword still hung at his side, a constant reminder of the weapon that had shattered it. A weapon forged by a smith he had never met. Now that same smith had done something impossible. Again. He'll come to me, Draven said to the darkness of his throne room. A craftsman like that cannot resist a challenge. He'll come. His hand closed around the hilt of his broken blade. He could feel it, the hunger for a weapon worthy of his hand, the certainty that somewhere out there, the one person capable of forging it was already on his way. Jin studied the orichalcon for 2 days before deciding what to do with it. The Super Rookie Tournament. That was the path to Draven. Win the tournament, earn an audience with the Sword King. But Draven had changed the rules. He no longer met with winners. He only watched from a distance, bored by the parade of fighters who came and went without impressing him. So Jin would have to do something that had never been done before. Not just win, dominate, achieve a contribution rate so high that Draven would have no choice but to take notice. He traveled to the capital of Valdris and registered for the tournament. The official at the desk, a weathered man named Bakal, barely glanced at him. Sword King Draven will observe, but will not meet with the winner, Bakal said flatly. Don't get your hopes up. Jin said nothing for a moment. Then, he asked where the nearest rental forge was. Bakal pointed him down the street and forgot about him entirely. That was a mistake. The rental forge was small, dim, and mostly empty. Jin set up his tools and laid the orichalcon on the workbench. The ore was extraordinary. Silver and black mithril fused together over thousands of years underground, compressed by geological force into something lighter than steel and harder than anything in the known world. Smelting it required precise temperature control. Too hot, and it evaporated. Too cold, and it shattered. The system itself fought him, reducing his skill effects by half, as if the game didn't believe a level 50 blacksmith had any business working with legendary materials. Jin set the furnace to 1850 degrees. He watched the orichalcon begin to soften, its surface rippling like liquid metal. Then he began to forge. He was making arrows, short, dense, orichalcon-tipped arrows designed to pierce through anything and return to their owner's hand. The divine crafting skill layered effects onto each one. Penetration, retrieval, a piercing ability that could punch through multiple targets in a single shot. He worked for 2 days straight, 91% completion rate. When he pulled the final arrow from the cooling rack and held it up to the light, the orichalcon tip gleamed like a fallen star. He needed to test it. Jin walked to the edge of the forest outside the capital and knocked the arrow. Ahead of him stood a row of troll trees, massive regenerating trunks that could heal any wound within seconds. He drew the bowstring back and released. The arrow punched through the first tree, then the second, then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. 6 troll trees pierced clean through in a straight line. The wood around each hole smoked and sizzled, unable to regenerate. The orichalcon had cauterized the wounds on impact. The arrow stopped, hung in the air for a heartbeat, then reversed direction and flew back into Jin's hand with a satisfying snap. An old NPC blacksmith named Falcon had been watching from the tree line. He stumbled forward, his eyes wide, his mouth working silently. He was a retired craftsman who had given up the forge years ago, convinced he had reached his limits. That arrow, Falcon stammered. "What you've made is remarkable, truly remarkable." He looked at Jin with something between reverence and desperation. "Please, what is your name?" Jin tucked the arrow into his quiver. "Blacksmith Jin." Falcon stood rooted to the spot long after Jin had walked away. Something had reignited inside him, a spark he thought had died years ago, the desire to pick up a hammer again. The Super Rookie Tournament began at dawn. Over 1,000 participants gathered on a vast plain outside the capital. Warriors, mages, assassins, rangers, every class represented. They stood in loose clusters, sizing each other up, trash-talking, boasting about what they would do when they got their hands on the prize. Bikal descended from the sky on the back of a wyvern. The crowd fell silent. "His Majesty Draven is watching," Bikal announced, "as are a number of other spectators. You cannot see them. They can see everything." The rules were simple. Defeat at least 3 opponents to advance. Contribution was tracked. The fighter who eliminated the most earned a bonus. Jin stood at the edge of the field, bow in hand, quiver on his back. A swordsman and an assassin approached him almost immediately, drawn by the fact that he looked like an easy target. Low level, strange class, no heavy armor, no visible threat. The swordsman grinned and raised his shield. "Hey there, nothing personal." Jin knocked an Orichalcon arrow and let it fly. The arrow punched through the steel shield like it was paper. It continued through the swordsman's chest, exited his back, and buried itself in the assassin standing behind him. Both of them dropped instantly, their health bars emptied in a single shot. Jin held out his hand. The arrow reversed course, ripped free of both bodies, and snapped back into his grip. Across the field, fighters stopped what they were doing and stared. Jin knocked the arrow again. 5 opponents had clustered together near a ridge, fighting each other in a tangled melee. He activated the piercing skill and released. The arrow tore through all 5 of them in a straight line. 5 eliminations, 1 shot. In the royal viewing chamber, high above the tournament grounds, Sword King Draven had been watching through a crystal orb with the dull expression of a man who had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. His expression changed. He leaned forward, his hawk-sharp eyes locked onto the field, onto the small figure with the bow who was dismantling the competition like a master carving would. "An interesting fellow," Draven murmured. His hand tightened on the arm of his throne. For the first time in years, Sword King Draven was paying attention. Jin did not slow down. The first stage of the tournament was chaos. Bodies flew. Skills erupted across the plain in bursts of fire and steel. Fighters who had been boasting minutes ago were scrambling for cover, realizing too late that the gap between ambition and ability was measured in seconds. Jin moved through it like a current through still water. An assassin rushed him from behind, dagger drawn, certain he had found an opening. Jin sidestepped without turning, drew his sword, and cut the man down in a single stroke. The assassin's last words were a whisper of disbelief before he dissolved into light. A swordsman charged next, confident in his heavy armor and close-range advantage. Jin's blade met him before he could swing. 1 slash. The man dropped, staring at the sky with empty eyes, unable to understand how a blacksmith had killed him faster than any warrior he had ever faced. 10 eliminations. Jin stopped counting. The first stage ended. Of the 1,000 who had entered, roughly 150 remained. The rest had been culled like wheat before a scythe. Bikal's voice echoed across the field from somewhere above. The second stage was different. Survival, not slaughter. Golems would attack the remaining fighters. Hold your ground for 60 seconds and advance. The earth split open, and stone creatures crawled out, lumbering toward the participants with fists like boulders. Most of them were manageable, strong, but predictable, the kind of enemy a competent fighter could handle with patience and positioning. Then the ground shook harder. Something massive pulled itself from the earth at the center of the field. Not the expected enemy, something far worse. A stone golem of a caliber that had no business appearing in a rookie tournament. It towered over the others, its body dense with ancient mineral, its eyes burning with a dull, murderous light. The air around it vibrated with raw, killing intent. One fighter charged it head-on. The golem's fist came down like a falling building. The fighter ceased to exist. Panic swept through the field like wildfire. Participants scattered. Some tried to run, others froze, paralyzed by the realization that this was no longer a test. It was an execution. High above, in the royal viewing chamber, Bikal turned to Draven with urgency carved into every line of his face. The wrong golem had been summoned. A mistake in the staging. At this level, it would massacre every participant on the field. "I must stop this," Bikal said. Draven's expression did not change. He studied the field the way a man studies a chessboard. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, he spoke. "Continue the tournament." Bikal stared at him. Draven's eyes were not on the golem. They were on Jin. "Give them one free use of any skill," Draven added. "No cooldown. That should keep them alive long enough." The notification rippled across every participant's screen. One skill, no restrictions. A lifeline thrown from the king's hand. Jin did not run. He stood in the center of the field, the massive golem bearing down on the scattered fighters, and made a decision that defied every rational instinct a sane person should have. He would kill it alone, not because he was reckless, not because he wanted glory, because killing that golem was the only path to the contribution rate he needed, 50%, the threshold that would guarantee an audience with Sword King Draven. Every other objective, every other plan, every calculation he had made since entering this tournament led to this single moment. He raised his voice across the battlefield, not a shout, a command. "I'll handle the big one, block the smaller golems, and stay alive." The remaining fighters stared at him. Some laughed, some cursed, but a handful listened, and that handful became a wall between the lesser golems and the rest of the survivors, giving Jin the space he needed. A title flickered into existence above his head: Battlefield Commander. The system itself had recognized what he was doing. Jin knocked an Orichalcon arrow and fired. The arrow struck the stone golem square in the chest. The impact was catastrophic. Stone cracked. The golem staggered backward, stunned, its massive body sliding across the earth. For 2 heartbeats, it could not move. Jin closed the distance, sword drawn. He had seconds before it recovered. He struck once, twice, 3 times. Each blow carved stone from the golem's body. Each impact sent vibrations up his arms that would have shattered a lesser fighter's bones. The golem's health dropped, 69%, 62%, falling, but not fast enough. The golem recovered. Its fist came down with the force of a collapsing wall. Jin dodged, but the shockwave caught him, rattling his skull, scrambling his vision. A stun effect. His body locked up for 2 agonizing seconds. The golem used that opening to swing again, not at Jin's body, at his sword. The blade shattered. Jin's weapon, the sword he had carried through every battle since Thornwall, broke apart in his hand like glass. Fragments scattered across the ground, glinting in the dust-choked light. The fighters watching from the perimeter felt their hearts drop. Without a weapon, the man who had been holding the line was finished. Some turned away. Others whispered prayers for a stranger they barely knew. Jin looked down at the fragments of his sword and smiled. "If I don't have a weapon," he said quietly, "I'll make one." His hands moved before the thought was fully formed. Emergency crafting. The shattered fragments of his sword became raw material. The divine skill activated, pulling the broken steel together, reshaping it, compressing it, folding it into something new in the span of a breath. 5 seconds. That was all it took. When he stood again, he held a crescent blade forged from the remains of his old sword. Damascus steel, layered and dense, with a cutting edge that hummed against the air. It was not elegant. It was not pretty. It was a weapon born from desperation and genius, and it was exactly what he needed. The golem swung at him. Jin ducked under its fist and drove the crescent blade into its arm. The arm came off. Stone and dust erupted from the severed joint. The golem screamed, a sound like grinding boulders, and staggered sideways. The remaining fighters gasped. The invisible spectators in the viewing chamber leaned forward. Jin did not stop. He drove the blade into the golem's chest, buried it deep, and whispered a single word. The skill activated. A whirlwind of slashes erupted from the point of impact, carving the golem apart from the inside. Stone flew in every direction. The golem's body cracked, split, and collapsed into rubble. Silence fell across the field. Then the notifications came. 14 level increases, thousands in gold, and a contribution rate of 95%. First place, by a margin so vast it wasn't even a competition. The award ceremony took place in the Great Hall of the Kingdom of Valdris. Jin knelt before the throne. The hall was lined with knights, retainers, officials, all watching the young man who had turned a disaster into a spectacle. Bikal stood to the side, his expression a mixture of relief and quiet awe. Sword King Draven descended from the throne. He moved like a predator, controlled, deliberate. Every step echoed through the hall. The gold he placed before Jin was 13,000 pieces, 13 times the promised reward. Draven turned to leave. The ceremony was over. Protocol demanded silence. The winner received his gold and departed with gratitude. Jin broke protocol. "I heard you were looking for me." The hall went rigid. Knights reached for their weapons. A retainer snarled something about insolence. Draven stopped mid-step. He turned slowly. Jin met his gaze without flinching. The burn scars on his face caught the torchlight. His eyes were calm, steady, and utterly without fear. "Blacksmith Jin," he said. "That's me." The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Then, Draven's expression shifted. The cold authority melted. What replaced it was something raw, something almost hungry. He stepped closer, his massive frame towering over Jin, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "I have been waiting for you." Draven did not waste time. The next morning, Jin was summoned to the audience chamber. The room was vast, cold, built from stone that had stood for centuries. Draven sat on his throne like a mountain that had decided to rest. Beside him stood the kingdom's chief blacksmith, a man named Cade, whose expression made it clear he considered Jin's presence an insult. Cade had already spoken to Draven. Outsiders, he had explained, crafted through probability. Their skills were borrowed, their results inconsistent. 1 in 100 attempts might produce something decent. It was luck, not mastery. A parlor trick dressed up as craftsmanship. Draven had listened, and then he had decided to see for himself. A retainer placed a box before Jin. Inside was a chunk of cold iron, a rare ore unique to Valdris. Blue-gray, dense, radiating a chill that made the air around it shimmer. It had properties that any blacksmith would recognize instantly. Fire resistance, ice enhancement, cutting power amplification. "I need a sword that can protect me from flames," Draven said. His voice was flat, measured, giving nothing away. "Can you make one?" Jin studied the ore. His mind was already working, analyzing its composition, calculating its potential. Cold iron was good, but what he really wanted was the legendary version. 10,000-year cold iron, the kind of material that existed in whispers and myths. Still, this was a test, and Jin did not fail tests. "It won't take long," he said. "I'll craft it right here." He placed his hands on the ore. The divine crafting skill activated. The audience chamber filled with light, then cold. 5 seconds of absolute focus. Every ounce of his skill compressed into a single moment of creation. When the light faded, the entire room was frozen. Ice crawled across the floor, up the columns, along the ceiling. The water in the ornamental fountain had turned to glass. The chandelier hung encased in frost, its crystals singing in the suddenly frigid air. The retainers shivered. The knights pulled their cloaks tighter. Even Cade, standing with his arms crossed and his expression locked in permanent disdain, could not hide the shock that rippled across his face. In Jin's hands was a sword, short, dense, radiating a cold so intense it fogged the air around it. Fire resistance pushed to 98%, far beyond anything Draven had asked for. Draven stared at the frozen room, then at the sword, then at Jin. "Is this probability?" he asked. "Or can you do this every time?" Jin met his eyes. It's skill. Something shifted behind Draven's expression. A door opening, a decision being made. "I will gamble on your skill, Blacksmith Jin." Draven leaned forward on his throne. "I ask you to craft my sword." The commission was simple in description, impossible in execution. Draven needed a sword that could survive the fire dragon's nest, a high-level dungeon where the heat was so intense it could melt unique-grade weapons on contact. Draven had attempted the raid twice before. Both times, his weapons had dissolved within minutes, leaving him defenseless against creatures born from magma and rage. At the heart of the dungeon waited Volrak, the fire demon, the monster that had killed Draven's son. Jin understood now. This was not a king seeking a weapon. This was a father seeking vengeance. Draven provided the materials. 100-year cold iron, epic grade, enough for 3 swords. A vice captain named Marin was assigned to oversee the process and deliver the finished weapons. She was young, silver-haired, with a cold expression that softened only when she spoke about Draven. "He doesn't have much time left," Marin said, as she led Jin to the royal forge. "He won't say it, but I can see it. Whatever is driving him, it's consuming him." Jin said nothing. He had seen that look before, in the mirror. He logged out to handle reality first. His landlady was waiting in the hallway with an apologetic expression and news that hit like a gut punch. The house was being sold. He had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. 2 weeks. The same deadline Draven had given him for the swords. Jin sat on his thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. The numbers ran through his head the way they always did. His father's hospital bills, the burn treatment, the forge rebuild, 4 billion won, and he was nowhere close. His phone buzzed. Sarah. She had been monitoring the community boards. His subscriber count had exploded overnight, from 130,000 to over 230,000, all because someone had spotted the character he carved into the arrowhead during the tournament, his signature, his name. The Aegis community was going wild, trying to figure out if Blacksmith Jin and the tournament's super rookie were the same person. Most of them had concluded it was impossible. Dual class restrictions made it unthinkable for someone at his level. "Let them argue," Jin said. Sarah laughed on the other end of the line. She already had a plan: keep both identities separate, let the mystery build, and when the time was right, reveal the truth in a way that would dominate every search ranking on the platform. "This sword for Draven," she said, her voice shifting to something more serious. "If he uses it with your name on it, every player in Aegis will know who forged it. This is the biggest branding opportunity you'll ever get." Jin's hand tightened around his phone. She was right, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the worry and the weight of everything he owed, a flame caught. He logged back in. The first sword took a day and a half. Jin poured everything into it. Fire resistance maximized at the expense of other attributes. Divine custom crafting pushed to its absolute limits. When he pulled the finished blade from the forge, it radiated a cold so deep the metal seemed to hum with frozen fury. Epic grade, fire resistance at 98%. Ice attribute attacks amplified against fire-type enemies. A sword built for one purpose and one purpose only: to survive the inferno. Marin took it and left without a word. She rode hard to the fire dragon's nest, where Draven was already deep inside, fighting through waves of magma creatures with weapons that were melting in his hands. When she placed the sword in his grip, Draven swung it at the nearest enemy, a magma golem twice his height. The golem froze solid. Ice spread from the point of impact across its molten body, locking it in place. Draven stared at the blade. His hands were trembling. Marin told him that Jin was already working on the second sword, and the third. "He says he has never crafted a common grade artifact," she added. "Not once." Draven looked at the frozen golem, then at the sword, then at the distant ceiling of the dungeon, where heat shimmered like a living thing. For the first time in a long time, something that looked like hope crossed his face. The second sword was built for offense. Jin shifted the balance. Less fire resistance, more ice damage output, a devastating area effect that could freeze every enemy within a wide radius. Another epic grade, another masterwork. Marin delivered it. Draven tested it, and with two swords in rotation, he carved a path deeper into the fire dragon's nest than he had ever gone before. Then the reports came back. Draven had pushed too far. He had reached Volrak's tomb, the deepest chamber of the dungeon, and the door had sealed behind him. He was trapped inside with the fire demon itself, and Volrak's power was beyond anything the swords could handle. The dungeon's scout, the only person in the kingdom capable of seeing into sealed chambers, delivered the news in a voice stripped of all emotion. Volrak could melt any weapon, even unique grade, even the swords Jin had forged. In that creature's presence, metal did not merely soften, it ceased to exist. Draven was fighting with his bare hands. An emergency quest appeared in Jin's vision. S rank, craft a sword that cannot melt. Reward unknown. Failure meant the Sword King's death. Marin stood in the doorway of the forge, her silver hair loose, her composure cracking for the first time. Her eyes were red. "Please," she said, "save His Majesty." Jin asked her to tell him the truth, all of it. Why Draven was willing to die in that dungeon. Marin told him. Draven's wife had died giving birth to their son. Draven had raised the boy alone, the only softness in a life built on steel and blood. When the prince turned 20, he begged his father to take him to the fire dragon's nest, just to see it, just once. Volrak killed him before Draven could draw his sword. Everything that had happened since, every raid, every broken weapon, every sleepless night spent staring at a necklace his son had given him, was leading to this. One final attempt, one last chance to look the thing that stole his child in the eyes and destroy it, even if it killed him, especially if it killed him. Jin's hands were still, his eyes burned. He thought of his own father, of fire, of loss so deep it became the architecture of your entire existence. He understood Draven completely. He placed his hands on the last piece of 100-year cold iron and began to forge. This time was different. There was no calculation, no optimization, no strategic balancing of attributes. Jin poured something into the metal that had no name in any crafting menu. Grief, empathy, the furious, aching need to give a broken man one more chance at peace. The metal responded. It sang under his hands. The temperature in the forge plummeted. Frost spread across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The door froze shut. The air itself turned to ice crystals that hung suspended in the forge light like frozen stars. A notification appeared that Jin had never seen before. Blacksmith's soul had activated. The skill that could not be learned, could not be trained, could not be triggered by any known method. It activated only when a blacksmith forged with absolute selflessness, when the creator's entire being was consumed by the act of creation. The sword's grade evolved. Epic became legendary. When Jin lifted the blade from the forge, the cold that radiated from it was not the cold of ice or winter. It was the cold of something eternal, something that would never break, never melt, never bend. a sword forged from grief and love, and the absolute refusal to let another father lose everything. Marin stared at it. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. No sword in this world, she whispered, could compare to this. They rode for Volrak's tomb together. The fire dragon's nest was a hell of molten stone and burning air. The walls glowed orange. The ground cracked beneath their feet, releasing jets of superheated gas. Lesser creatures fled from the cold that radiated from the sword in Marin's hands, their instincts screaming that something unnatural was approaching. The sealed door to Volrak's tomb was already cracking from the heat inside. Marin froze it open with the legendary blade's ambient cold. They stepped through into an inferno. Draven was alive, barely. He crouched behind a ridge of volcanic rock, his armor half melted, his skin blistered, his weapons reduced to puddles of liquid metal at his feet. The necklace his son had given him was dissolving against his chest, the chain glowing white hot. He was watching it melt with the expression of a man who had already accepted death. Volrak stood at the center of the chamber, 3 meters tall, wreathed in flames so intense the air around it warped and twisted. A spear of pure fire burned in its grip. It radiated power the way a sun radiates heat, indifferent and absolute. Draven looked up and saw Jin standing in the entrance, blue armor shimmering with cold, the legendary sword in his hands. Jin walked forward. The flames parted around him, pushed back by the sword's freezing aura. He placed the blade in Draven's hand and stepped back. "You won't be able to melt that," Jin said to the demon. It was not a boast, it was a fact. Draven gripped the sword. The cold surged through his body. His burns stopped screaming. His vision cleared. The despair that had been drowning him for years retreated, replaced by something older and stronger. Purpose. He charged. The demon met him with fire. The spear came down in a blazing arc that should have incinerated everything it touched. Draven's sword caught it. The fire died on contact. Ice spread from the point of impact along the spear's shaft, and Volrak recoiled, its flames flickering for the first time in its ancient existence. The thing that had burned everything it touched had finally met something it could not melt. Draven fought like a man possessed. Every swing of the legendary blade sent waves of freezing energy through the chamber. The walls frosted over. The magma hardened. The unbearable heat gave way, degree by degree, to a cold that made the demon scream. Then, Draven activated the blade's ultimate skill, Frostflower. The air crystallized. Snow formed from nothing, swirling around the demon in a tightening spiral. Ice bloomed across Volrak's body, like flowers opening in reverse, freezing its flames, cracking its armor, locking it in place. The demon thrashed, roared, tried to burn its way free. The ice held. Draven's sword came down one final time. The blow split Volrak from crown to core. The demon shattered like glass, its body breaking apart into shards of frozen fire that dissolved before they hit the ground. Silence. Then the dying eruption. Named monsters do not die quietly. Volrak's death triggered a final burst of flame that filled the entire chamber. A wall of fire so hot it turned the air white. There was no dodging it, no blocking it. It was the demon's last act of spite. A killing curse designed to take its slayer with it. Draven collapsed. His body had nothing left. The legendary sword fell from his fingers. The flames roared toward him, and he closed his eyes. He thought of his son, of the boy's smile, of the necklace that was now nothing but ash against his chest. It was enough. He had done what he came to do. He could rest now. Then, someone walked through the fire. Jin moved through the inferno as if it were rain. His blue armor held, barely, its cold aura fighting the heat with everything it had. Frost cracked and reformed across his body with every step. He was burning and freezing at the same time, his health dropping with every heartbeat. He knelt beside Draven. The Sword King opened his eyes and saw the blacksmith crouching over him, flames licking at his shoulders, his face calm despite the fact that his body was disintegrating. Jin said something. Marin, watching from beyond the flames, could not hear the words, but she saw Draven's expression change. The resignation faded. The death wish that had driven him for years cracked, then broke, then fell away like old armor that no longer fit. Jin smiled. Then his body crumbled into ash. Not death, not for an outsider, but the cost was paid in full. Every piece of equipment destroyed, every buff erased, his avatar scattered like embers in the wind, returned to the void between Logout and Logan, carrying nothing with it but the memory of what it had done. Draven crawled out of the tomb. Marin found him at the dungeon's entrance, collapsed against the stone, his massive body broken and burned and barely breathing. She carried him on her back for 3 miles through the cooling dungeon, past the frozen remains of monsters and the cracked walls where magma had solidified into black glass. He did not speak for 2 days. When he finally opened his eyes, in a bed in the royal quarters, with Marin sitting beside him and the sun pouring through the window, The first words out of his mouth were not about victory. "I miss him," Draven said. Marin thought he meant his son. Then he said it again, and she understood. "Jin, I miss that boy so very much." He turned his face toward the window. The legendary sword lay on the table beside his bed, still radiating its impossible cold, still bearing the mark Jin had carved into the steel. A single character, a name, a promise. The sword that saved the king. The blacksmith who walked through fire to remind a grieving father that living was not the same as giving up. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment with a 2-week eviction notice and a phone full of messages, Jin was already logging back in, already planning the next forge, already building something from nothing, the way he always had, the way he always would. The Sword King owed him a debt that gold could never repay, and Jin hadn't even asked for payment. Jin logged back in to find a different man sitting on the throne, not different in body. Draven was still the same towering figure, the same scarred hands, the same weight of a kingdom pressed into every line of his face. But the eyes had changed. The hollow, death-chasing hunger that had driven him into Volrak's tomb was gone. In its place was something quieter, something that looked almost like peace. Draven did not greet him with formality. He rose from his seat, descended the steps, and stood before Jin the way a man stands before someone who pulled him back from the edge. "Before I became the lord of this kingdom," Draven said, "I was a swordsman." He spoke about his past, about the art he had mastered in his youth, the supreme swordsmanship of the primordial kingdom, the blade technique that had tamed the monster waves and built Valdris from blood and stone. He spoke about it the way old soldiers speak about wars they survived, with reverence and a faint, unshakable grief. Then he looked at Jin and said something that made the blacksmith's breath catch. "You were born to forge. That much is beyond doubt. But there is another talent in you, Jin, the talent of a swordsman." He referenced an evaluation, written observations of Jin's physical instincts, his reflexes, his intuitive understanding of every weapon type he had ever touched. Things Jin had never thought twice about. Things Draven had been watching since the tournament. "I will show you a fragment of my swordsmanship," Draven said. "Learn what you can." The training lasted a month. Every morning, Jin stood in the palace courtyard with a blade in his hand and the Sword King bearing down on him like a storm that had learned patience. Draven did not teach gently. He taught the way mountains teach rivers, through resistance, through relentless pressure, through the slow, grinding erosion of everything that was not essential. Jin's body remembered things his mind had forgotten. The uncles who had placed wooden swords in his hands when he was 10. The hours spent swinging at nothing, building muscle memory from raw repetition. It all came flooding back, fused now with Draven's supreme technique, reshaped into something sharper and more dangerous than either origin alone. He learned to channel killing intent through his stance. He learned the raging sword, which layered devastation onto every strike. He learned Sword's Cry, a technique that paralyzed the senses of every enemy within range. By the end of the month, the man who watched from the edge of the courtyard, a mustached commander named Theron, wore an expression that hovered between disbelief and grudging respect. "The training is complete," Theron said quietly. Draven nodded. He sheathed his blade and looked at Jin with something that might have been envy or might have been pride. "Go," the Sword King said. "Forge what only you can forge." Jin left Valdris with new steel in his hands and new fire in his blood. Before departing, he forged equipment to compensate for his still modest level. A helmet with damage reflection, an arrow set built for precision, a rare grade bow with piercing capability, crafted entirely from starting zone materials, something that should have been impossible for any blacksmith, let alone one at his tier. He placed the bow on the auction house. It sold within hours for a sum that made his eyes widen. 2 million won for a single weapon. The community boards erupted. Analysts compared his work to the output of the world's top-ranked blacksmith and found Jin's creations equal or superior, crafted at a fraction of the level. His subscriber count climbed past 3,000, then past 30,000. Guild invitations flooded his inbox. Commission requests stacked up faster than he could read them. Jin closed the notifications. He had somewhere to be. The Tower of Blacksmiths stood at the edge of a forest, so green it looked painted. Jin had heard of it. Every serious crafter in Aegis had. A legendary structure built in the age before guilds, when blacksmiths were revered as artists, and their forges were temples. No one had entered it in living memory. The front gate was sealed with chains that pulsed with old magic, and the door itself was carved from volcanic basalt, dense and unyielding. Jin stood before it and studied the seal. His fingers traced the surface. Basalt, volcanic stone, a lock designed to be opened by only one thing, a sword forged in the magical forge that waited inside. He found the entrance to the forge around the side of the tower, a smaller door, unguarded, radiating faint warmth. He stepped through. The magical forge was unlike anything he had ever seen. Tools lined every wall. Anvils of different sizes gleamed under sourceless light, and the materials were limitless. Iron, steel, alloys, ores he had never touched, all stacked in endless supply, as if the forge existed outside the rules that governed the rest of the world. There was a catch. Anything forged here could only be used for the test. One sword, one chance. Cut the basalt seal or fail. Jin's eyes moved across the materials. His mind was already working, calculating, designing. A sword capable of cutting stone, not just any stone. Volcanic basalt, the hardest natural material in Aegis. He reached for his transformed pickaxe, feeling its weight, its edge, its potential. A sword can cut stone, he murmured, remembering his father's words. If the smith understands both. He grasped the hammer and began. Somewhere above, in a chamber choked with dust and empty bottles, the tower's master stirred. His name was Varn. Once, he had been the greatest swordsmith in the known world. Now he was a bitter, hollow man who drank alone and cursed the era that had forgotten him. The age of blacksmiths was dead, he told himself. No one sought the true power of the forge anymore. They wanted gold. They wanted shortcuts. They wanted titles without mastery. Varn had stopped caring years ago. The tower's seal had never been broken. Hundreds had tried. Thousands. Every one of them had swung their pathetic swords at the basalt and achieved nothing more than a scratch on the surface. He took another drink and closed his eyes. Then the tower began to shake. The hammering did not stop. Varn sat up. The bottles rattled on the floor. The walls trembled. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in thin streams, and the ancient chains holding the tower's framework groaned with a sound they had not made in centuries. What the hell is happening? Varn muttered, stumbling to the window. The hammering intensified, not the clumsy pounding of an amateur. This was rhythmic, precise, relentless. Each strike sent vibrations through the tower's skeleton, resonating with the structure, as if the forge itself was waking up from a long sleep. Varn's eyes went wide. Below, in the magical forge, Jin was crafting a Damascus sword. The notification had warned him. Damascus forging was restricted to master-level blacksmiths. The system recommended starting with a basic iron dagger. Jin had dismissed the warning without reading the second line. He worked with everything he had. The techniques his father had taught him. The precision Draven's training had sharpened. The instinct that had carried him through every forge, every commission, every impossible deadline. The metal folded and sang under his hammer, layer upon layer of Damascus steel, compressed and refined. Each fold adding density, each strike adding purpose. The tower shook harder. Varn's mouth fell open. Through the window, he could see the chains on the sealed door glowing, cracking. The magical energy that had held the basalt gate shut for 100 years was unraveling, strand by strand, broken not by force, but by the resonance of a forge pushed beyond its limits. The chains shattered. Light erupted from the broken seal, flooding the courtyard, illuminating the tower in a blinding column of white. Varn's legs gave out. He sank to the floor, staring at the light with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. Someone broke the seal, he whispered. That's not possible, but it was. The light dimmed, and through the open gate, a figure stepped into the tower. Dust and forge smoke clung to his shoulders. A Damascus blade hung at his side, still radiating heat. His face was calm, composed, utterly unbothered by the fact that he had just accomplished something no blacksmith in the history of Aegis had ever done. Varn stared at him from across the chamber. Finally, the old master breathed. The god of the forge has arrived. Jin looked at the kneeling man and paused. "Excuse me," he said. "Did I pass the test?" Varn did not answer immediately. He was staring at the measuring stone, the ancient device used to evaluate every smith who entered the tower. Jin's Damascus blade had not merely scored it, it had shattered it. The stone lay in pieces on the floor, its fragments still glowing faintly, unable to contain the measurement of what had just been forged. Varn's hands trembled as he knelt among the broken pieces. "I cannot measure you," Varn said. "The stone was never built for this." A magic circle blazed to life beneath their feet. The floor hummed. The air tightened. Jin looked down at the glowing sigil and felt something ancient stir in the tower's bones. Varn reached behind him and produced a hammer. Not a decorative piece, not a relic, a tool worn smooth from decades of use, radiating the kind of quiet power that only came from being wielded by a true master. "Take my hammer," Varn said. "It has waited long enough for hands that deserve it." Jin hesitated. Then he reached out and closed his fingers around the grip. The weight was perfect. The balance was flawless. It felt like coming home. A notification confirmed the acquisition. Varn's hammer, a tool forged by the last great swordsmith, carrying with it the accumulated knowledge of a dying art. Then the real test revealed itself. The magic circle flared brighter. The walls of the tower dissolved into darkness. A voice, not Varn's, echoed through the void. There is a true trial you must overcome. Jin tightened his grip on the hammer. The darkness around him solidified into stone walls, a castle courtyard, a night sky boiling with unnatural energy. He was no longer in the tower. He was somewhere else entirely, standing on ancient battlements as something massive descended from the clouds. A swirling column of destructive energy slammed into the castle walls. The ground buckled. Stones flew. Jin braced himself as the shockwave hit, his feet sliding across the cracked courtyard. He looked up. The sky was full of them. An army, not human, not beast, something worse. The mission prompt materialized in burning letters before his eyes. Defeat the invading orc army. Jin stared at it. His jaw tightened. This was supposed to be a blacksmith's trial, not a battlefield. But the hammer in his hand was warm, and the forge fire in his chest had not gone out. And somewhere beneath the shock, a grim, familiar resolve was already settling into place. He had walked through fire for a king. He had broken a seal that had stood for a century. He had forged weapons that gods would envy from scraps that other smiths would have thrown away. An army of orcs was just another problem that needed a better tool. Jin raised the hammer and stepped forward into the dark. The dark swallowed him whole and then spat him out onto a wall. Jin stood on ancient battlements, the wind sharp against his face, the horizon glowing with the wrong kind of light. Fires, dozens of them, scattered across the hills like fallen stars. The sounds reached him next. War drums, guttural roaring, the unmistakable thunder of an army on the march. A mission prompt burned in his vision. Subjugate the invading orcs. Rank SS. He stared at it. A blacksmith's trial that demanded a soldier's work. Varn had sent him here, or the tower had, or whatever ancient force still governed this place. Either way, the orcs were real, and the walls were crumbling, and Jin was standing on them with a hammer in his hand and no army at his back. Then the reinforcements arrived. 50 warriors marched through the gate below, armored, disciplined, their faces set with the grim focus of men who had done this before. At their head walked a broad-shouldered man with a captain's insignia and tired eyes. Harlan, subjugation captain. Harlan thanked them all for coming. He spoke about the orc raids growing worse, each wave more savage than the last. Their weapons were battered, their numbers were thin. And then his gaze landed on Jin, and something like hope flickered across his weathered face. "You're the one Varn sent?" Jin nodded. Harlan's eyes dropped to the hammer. "Can you repair our weapons? We've been fighting with damaged steel for weeks." Jin's stomach tightened. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then told the truth. He hadn't completed his class advancement yet. No smithing abilities were available. Not here, not now. The hope drained from Harlan's face like water through cracked stone. "So you can't forge, and you can't fight?" Harlan's voice was flat, not cruel, just exhausted. "We expected reinforcements. Instead, we got someone we'll have to protect." The warriors behind him exchanged uneasy glances. Jin felt every one of them. They told him to wait in the watchtower. Jin climbed the steps and stood in the narrow chamber above the gate, watching through the slit windows as the warriors assembled below. The orc horde was close now. He could see their shapes moving through the tree line, hunched and enormous, their weapons catching firelight. Then it happened. An orcax came screaming through the darkness toward one of the soldiers near the wall. Jin saw the trajectory before his mind caught up with his body. He was already moving, already falling, already swinging. The Damascus blade met the axe mid-arc. Steel shrieked against crude iron. The axe spun away and clattered to the ground. The soldier stumbled backward, eyes wide, mouth open. Jin stood in the gap, breathing hard, the blade still humming in his grip. Everyone stared. "I know I'm still a novice," Jin said quietly. He managed a small, steady smile. "But can I join the battle?" The silence stretched. Then Harlan stepped forward, studied Jin's face for a long moment, and pointed toward a squad forming near the eastern wall. "Follow Kale's squad," Harlan said. "They'll show you the basics." "And Jin?" The captain's voice roughened with something that was not quite confidence, but was no longer doubt. "We're counting on you." Jin had fought goblins. He remembered the clumsy swings, the slow reactions, the almost comical predictability of creatures that attacked with more rage than sense. Orcs were nothing like goblins. The first one came at him with a rusted cleaver that weighed more than Jin did. Its eyes burned red. Its body moved with a brutal, practiced efficiency that spoke of a creature born for war. Jin blocked, pivoted, and felt the impact rattle through his arms like a hammer blow. But the month with Draven had changed him. His feet remembered. His shoulders remembered. The killing intent that the Sword King had beaten into his muscles rose like heat from a forge. Jin did not retreat. He stepped inside the orc's reach, dropped his center of gravity, and drove the Damascus blade upward in a single, clean arc. The orc fell. A notification flashed. Level up. Jin barely registered it. Another orc was already charging. He met it head on, blade singing, each strike landing with the precision of a man who understood metal at its molecular level and had learned to treat combat the same way. In Kale's squad, a soldier watched Jin cut down a third orc and shook his head in disbelief. "Why hasn't he changed classes yet?" the soldier muttered. No one had an answer. Then a scream cut through the battlefield. Kale, the squad leader, was on his knees. An orc towered over him, axe raised, and there was no one close enough to intervene. No one except Jin. Jin's hand moved before his thoughts caught up. He dropped the sword. His fingers found the bow at his back, the gagung he had forged himself, compact and deceptively powerful. He knocked an arrow, drew, and released in a single fluid motion. The arrow crossed the distance in less than a heartbeat. It struck the orc between the eyes with a sound like a thunderclap. The creature's head snapped back. Its axe fell from nerveless fingers. It collapsed in a heap of muscle and iron, dead before it hit the ground. Kale looked up, blood running down his temple, and stared at Jin with the wide eyes of a man who had just watched his own death get cancelled. Jin did not stop. He knocked another arrow, released. Another orc pitched forward, the shaft buried in its throat. A third arrow found a target at the edge of the melee, punching through crude armor like it was parchment. A soldier nearby whispered what everyone was thinking. He killed a giant orc with a single arrow. Harlan's voice cut through the chaos. "Kale, pull yourself together." But Kale was still staring at the blacksmith with the bow, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about class and level and the rules of combat. The orcs noticed Jin. That was the problem with excellence on a battlefield. It drew attention. A cluster of orc warriors broke from the main line and charged directly at him, axes high, bellowing war cries that shook dust from the walls. Kale saw it first. He threw himself toward Jin, shield raised, but the angle was wrong, and the distance was too great, and the orcs were too fast. Jin did not flinch. He switched weapons mid-stride, the bow vanishing, the Damascus blade reappearing in his grip as if it had never left. A skill activated. The blade erupted with light, and Jin spun through the oncoming pack like a storm given form. Every orc within 10 meters took the hit. The area attack carved through them without discrimination, dropping 3 in the first rotation, staggering 2 more, sending the rest scrambling backward with expressions that almost looked like fear. When the light faded, Jin stood in a circle of fallen enemies. A level-up notification pulsed at the edge of his vision. His contribution rate climbed to 19%. Kale reached him, breathing hard. His face was twisted with guilt. "He risked his life to save me," Kale said to no one in particular. "If it weren't for me, he wouldn't have been..." Jin shook his head. Focus forward. Harlan found Jin after the wave receded. The captain stood before the assembled warriors, and for the first time since Jin had arrived, the exhaustion in his face had been replaced by something fiercer, something that looked like belief. "Varn didn't send him here for nothing," Harlan told the soldiers, his fist clenched at his side. "With this man, we can win." A murmur ran through the ranks. Then it grew. Soldiers straightened, shields rose. The morale of the subjugation squad surged like a tide reversing, and Jin could feel it in the air, the way men fought harder when they believed victory was possible. He charged back into the fray. The Damascus blade flashed. Orcs fell. His contribution climbed to 28%, but something nagged at him. The numbers were rising slower than they should. Too many warriors sharing the kills. Too much ground to cover. Then a notification appeared that changed everything. Secret mission unlocked. Jin's eyes narrowed. He pushed deeper into the battlefield, past the defensive line, past the comfort of allied shields. Whatever this hidden objective was, it waited in the dark beyond the front. The dark delivered something worse. A new orc emerged from the tree line, not the hunched, savage fighters Jin had been cutting through. This one stood upright, massive. Its armor was fused to its skin like an exoskeleton, and the axe it carried was longer than Jin was tall. Its eyes burned with an intelligence the others lacked. An orc warrior, the elite variant, the one that Harlan's squad had never been able to defeat. "Everyone, stop!" Harlan's voice cracked across the battlefield. "Fall back! We're surrounded!" Jin looked left. right, behind. Harlan was right. While they had been pushing forward, drunk on momentum, the orc army had closed the circle. Warriors were everywhere, and at the center of the trap stood the elite, patient and massive, and waiting. A soldier cursed under his breath. We pushed too far. We focused on the fight and lost sight of the ground. Harlan's face hardened. The despair was there, buried deep, but so was something else, a refusal to bend. He drew his blade and turned to face the elite orc with the look of a man who had decided that if this was the end, he would meet it standing. "We will never retreat," Harlan said. The soldiers roared. They charged. Harlan led the advance, shield forward, blade high, and the warriors followed with the desperate courage of men who had run out of options and found something cleaner on the other side of fear. The formation was ragged, reckless, fueled by fury rather than strategy. Jin saw the cracks immediately. They were going to break against the elite orc like water against stone. Their weapons would bounce off that armored skin. Their morale would shatter when the first wave failed. He raised the bow. The arrow struck the elite orc's shoulder and glanced off. The armored hide absorbed the impact like it was nothing. Jin fired again. Same result. The penetration that had punched through every other orc on this battlefield could not breach this creature's natural plating. His jaw clenched. The bow was not enough. Not for this. Around him, soldiers were realizing the same thing. Blades scraped uselessly against the orc warrior's skin. Spears bent. Shields cracked under the force of its counterswings. It moved through the formation like a boulder rolling through tall grass. "We'll have to retreat again," someone whispered. No. Harlan's voice was raw. Blood ran from a cut above his eye. "We cannot run anymore." Jin stopped thinking like an archer. He stopped thinking like a novice. He stopped thinking about class restrictions and level gaps and every rule the system had ever tried to impose on what he was allowed to do. He thought like a blacksmith. The elite orc's skin was armor. Fine. He had spent his entire life understanding armor. He knew where metal was weakest. He knew where stress fractures formed. He knew that no defense, no matter how perfect, survived a strike delivered at the exact right angle with the exact right force. Jin surged forward. The Damascus blade came up. He did not swing wildly. He did not hack at the surface the way the soldiers had. He studied the orc's body in the half-second before contact, reading its hide the way he read raw steel on an anvil, identifying the seam, the grain, the one place where the structure would give. He found it. The blade drove home. The elite orc staggered. A roar of fury and pain erupted from its throat, a sound that silenced everything else on the battlefield. Jin twisted the blade and pulled it free, and the orc warrior's knees buckled. It fell. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 warriors stood in the rain, chests heaving, staring at the impossible. The creature they had never defeated lay motionless in the mud, and the man standing over it was a classless blacksmith who had no business being on a battlefield at all. Then, a voice broke the silence. Desperate, terrified. "Captain!" Jin spun. Harlan was on the ground. The old captain had taken a blow during the charge that Jin had not seen. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading. A soldier was already kneeling at his side, pressing both hands against the wound, screaming for help that might arrive too late. Jin's grip tightened on the blade. The orc army was broken, but the cost was written in the blood of the man who had given him a chance when no one else would. The battle was won. The war was far from over. The elite orc was dead, but the battle was not done dying. Jin stood over the fallen creature, rain dripping from the Damascus blade, and counted the cost. Harlan was down. The captain lay in the mud with a wound that no field dressing would close, and the soldiers around him moved with the frantic, hollow efficiency of men who already knew the truth but refused to speak it. "It's useless," someone whispered behind a shield wall. The words spread like rot. The remaining orcs pressed in from 3 sides. Not the elites, not the clever ones, but enough of them. Enough cleavers and enough rage to grind 50 exhausted soldiers into the dirt. The formation buckled. Shields trembled. Fear crawled across the line like frost. Jin scanned the field. The soldiers were breaking, not from cowardice, but from arithmetic. They had spent everything on the charge, and the horde still had numbers. "Fall back to the forest," Jin said. Heads turned. A soldier blinked. "What?" "Behind us. The trees will break their charge and funnel their numbers." Jin pointed with the blade. "Retreat to the forest. Now." No one moved. Then Kale, bloodied and limping, straightened his back and barked the order. "You heard him! Everyone, move! Get the captain to cover!" They ran. The forest swallowed them in green and shadow. Branches tangled overhead, roots snaked across the ground, and the massive orc bodies that had moved like battering rams in the open field suddenly became clumsy, crashing into trunks, tripping over undergrowth. The funnel worked. What had been an overwhelming charge became a slow, stumbling trickle. Kale organized what was left of the line between the trees. Shields braced against the narrow gaps. He looked back at Jin, sweat cutting channels through the grime on his face. "Jin, the forest will slow them. but it slows us too. We can't hold forever. I don't need forever, Jin said. I need 5 minutes. Kale stared at him, then nodded. We'll hold, whatever it costs. Jin vanished deeper into the trees. The soldiers dug in. Orcs crashed against the makeshift barricade. Steel rang. Men screamed. The line bent, but did not break, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the memory of a blacksmith who had asked for 5 minutes as though that were enough to change everything. Moonlight filtered through bamboo. Jin knelt in a clearing, the world shrinking to the space between his hands. He pulled the duplicate hammer from his pack, Varn's hammer, the relic that could copy consumables and cut creation time in half. He had carried it since the tower, waiting for the right moment. This was the moment. No forge could be impenetrable against everything. Jin had proved that with the elite orc. Every armor had a fracture point. Every defense had a grain. The problem was that his arrows could not find that grain, not at range, not with the speed the battlefield demanded. So he would build something that could. I can do this, he muttered. His hands moved. Bamboo split under his knife. He carved a narrow channel, shaped a grip, fashioned a throwing cradle, a spear thrower, ancient, brutal, effective, the kind of weapon that turned a man's arm into a siege engine. Then the arrows. He pulled the aegisal shafts from his quiver, the short arrows he had crafted from rare horn, attack power that punched above their weight, penetration that multiplied on impact, speed that turned air into a scream. He set the duplicate hammer against the first arrow and felt the relic pulse. 1 became 2, 2 became 4. The copies gleamed with the same pale light as the originals. Jin loaded the first aegisal into the spear thrower, felt the balance, and allowed himself 1 breath. Then he ran back toward the screaming. The line was fracturing. A monstrous shape had broken through the trees. Not just an orc, something bigger, something armored in plates of fused bone and iron, carrying an axe that could split a horse in 2. It bulldozed through the barricade like it was made of paper, scattering soldiers, crushing shields underfoot. A knight in blue stumbled backward, eyes wide. What is happening? Kale rallied the remaining shields. Hold tight. Create an opening for Jin. Jin emerged from the tree line at a dead sprint. He loaded the spear thrower, planted his back foot, and hurled the first aegisal with everything he had. The arrow crossed the gap in a blur. It struck the armored orc's helmet and punched through the faceplate with a sound like a gunshot. The creature staggered. Its head snapped sideways. Fragments of bone armor sprayed into the air. Kale's mouth fell open. The penetration of the aegisal was not an arrow's penetration. It was a bullet's. The hornbow's set bonus multiplied the force, and the spear thrower multiplied it again. And what hit the orc hit it with the authority of a weapon that had no business existing on a battlefield this primitive. Jin loaded a second arrow, through. The shaft buried itself in the creature's shoulder joint, right where the bone plates met. Right in the seam, Jin's blacksmith eyes had found in a fraction of a second. The orc bellowed and swung its axe wildly, but the damage was done. Its arm was compromised. A third arrow, throat. The orc warrior crashed to the earth like a felled tower, and the ground shook when it landed. The kill triggered something. A surge of energy tore through Jin's body. The world brightened, sharpened, then settled into a new clarity. Levels climbed, not 1, not 2, a cascade that kept going, each notification stacking on the last until he lost count. Then a new title burned across his vision. Orc Slayer. Damage against orcs increased. Fear induced on sight. Jin turned toward the remaining horde. The nearest orc met his eyes and froze. Its weapon arm trembled. Its lips pulled back in a snarl that was not aggression, but terror. The orc dropped its weapon and ran. Others followed. The fear spread through the horde like wildfire. Orc after orc breaking ranks, abandoning their positions, fleeing into the forest with panicked howls. The army that had surrounded them minutes ago dissolved into chaos. A soldier shouted, "Get them! Don't let them regroup!" But it was already over. The orcs were gone, not defeated by superior numbers or brilliant strategy, but broken by something older and simpler. The primal recognition that the thing standing on that hill with blood on its blade was not prey. It was the predator. Under the crescent moon, a figure landed on the ridge above the battlefield. Armor dark as midnight, eyes glowing red beneath a visor, a sword drawn with the slow deliberation of someone who had never needed to hurry. The newcomer surveyed the carnage below with the calm interest of a wolf watching sheep. Then he moved. The attack came without warning, a blur of dark steel that sent the nearest soldier flying backward into the trees. The impact echoed like thunder. 2 more soldiers went down before anyone understood what was happening. Jin spun. The Dark Knight stood in the center of the clearing, sword raised, red light bleeding from the blade. Not an orc, something else entirely, something that fought with precision and power that dwarfed everything Jin had faced tonight. They clashed. The Damascus blade met the dark sword in a shower of sparks, and Jin felt the force travel through his arms, his shoulders, his spine. He was outmatched. The knight's strikes came faster, harder, each one driving Jin back another step. But the mission was clear. The SS rank trial was not about a single duel. It was about the army, the orcs, the territory, everything. Jin planted his feet and held. The Dark Knight pressed. Steel screamed against steel. The clearing erupted with light and force and fury. Trees splintering, earth cratering under the weight of blows that should have killed a man 10 times over. And through it all, Jin refused to fall. The knight faltered. Just once. Just enough. Jin's counter came from muscle memory, from the months with Draven, from every blow the Sword King had landed on his body until the instinct was carved into his bones. The Damascus blade found the gap in the dark armor, and the knight staggered, and the red light in its eyes flickered. Mission complete. Contribution rate, 92%. Jin stood alone on the ridge, chest heaving, blade trembling in his grip. Below him, the battlefield was silent. The orc army was shattered. The Dark Knight was gone, and the notification that burned in his vision said what his body already knew: phenomenal success. Dawn broke golden over the ridge. Jin stood on the cliff's edge, silhouetted against the rising sun, and listened to the sound he had never expected to hear: cheering. Not the desperate roar of men in battle, but the raw, unguarded joy of men who had survived something they should not have survived. "Jin!" the soldiers shouted, his name over and over, filling the valley. A new achievement flashed: Commander of the Battlefield, a title earned not through rank or class, but through what he had done when rank and class said he should not have been able to do anything at all. Kale found him first. The squad leader was battered, one arm hanging useless at his side, but he was grinning with the wild relief of a man reborn. "From barely defending ourselves," Kale said, his voice cracking, "to this. I never thought I'd see anything like it in my lifetime." Behind him, another soldier dropped to one knee, fist pressed to his chest. Then another, then 10 more. The entire surviving force, one by one, placed their hands over their hearts and bowed their heads. Harlan was there too. They had carried him from the forest, bandaged and pale, but breathing. The old captain looked up at Jin, with tears cutting through the blood on his face. "Thank you," Harlan whispered, "from the bottom of my heart." Jin looked at them, at all of them. The soldiers who had doubted him, the captain who had given him a chance, the men who had held the line when he asked for 5 minutes. He placed his own hand over his chest. "I am also grateful," Jin said quietly. The sun climbed higher. The warmth spread across the ridge, across the wounded and the weary and the living. And for one perfect moment, the war felt very far away. The trial was over. The battlefield faded behind him like a dream dissolving in morning light. Jin stood in the quiet aftermath and clenched his fist. He had entered that trial as a classless blacksmith who could barely swing a sword. He was leaving it as something else entirely. Not a warrior, not a knight, but something the system had not prepared for. A craftsman who refused to stay at the anvil. "Time to go back to the Tower of Smiths," he said aloud. Then he paused, scratched his head, frowned. How exactly did he get back? The answer came in the form of a summons. The central tower, the Hall of Smiths, a place that existed at the heart of the world's oldest craft, where the greatest blacksmiths in history had once gathered to forge weapons that shaped kingdoms. Jin arrived to find it hollow. The halls were vast and empty. Dust covered the anvils. Cobwebs stretched across doorways that had once admitted legends. A single figure stood in the great chamber, old and weathered, his expression carrying the weight of decades spent watching something precious die. "The Tower of Smiths is in decline," the old master said. His voice echoed in the emptiness. "All the glory went to the knights. The only ones who come to us now are those blinded by gold." Jin listened. The old master spoke of a sword, not just any sword, a blade left behind by the god of smiths himself, waiting for a wielder worthy of its legacy. Candidates had come over the years, dozens, hundreds. None had fulfilled the prophecy. The old master's eyes found Jin, and something shifted in them. Not hope, not yet, but the faint, dangerous stirring of recognition. "We need someone with the true spirit of a blacksmith," the old master said. "Someone worthy of wielding that sword." Jin said nothing, but his fingers tightened at his sides, and the forge heat that lived in his blood burned a little brighter. The sword was waiting, and for the first time in a very long time, the Tower of Smiths had a reason to believe that the wait might finally be over. The sword was waiting, and so was Jin. He stood in the Hall of Smiths, surrounded by dust and silence, and the ghosts of a craft that had once shaped kingdoms. Before him, Darren, the Tower Master of Swords, spoke in low tones to a figure Jin had never seen before. The stranger wore the tattered robes of a priest, threadbare and faded, as though he had been wandering for years, with no congregation to return to. His name was Serath, and he was the last divine messenger of the god of smiths. Serath looked at Jin the way a starving man looks at bread he does not trust. The prophecy speaks of a successor, Serath said. His voice was flat, hollowed out by exhaustion. One who would wield the sword left behind by the god of smiths and restore our order. Candidates have come, dozens, hundreds. He paused. All of them failed. Darren stepped forward. This one is different. They always say that. Serath turned to Jin. The god of smiths has a few followers left. The Church of Aegis takes them all. Warriors, paladins, knights. No one kneels before an anvil anymore. His eyes hardened, and the god has grown tired of waiting. If this trial fails, the god will abandon his descendants entirely. The title, the legacy, the bloodline, all of it, severed. Corvin, the tower master of bows, stood in the shadows with his arms crossed. His face was pale. He had denied the god once before. Now the stakes were real, and the room felt like a funeral that had not yet decided whose. Serath gestured to the center of the hall. A sword rested on a stone pedestal, ancient and unmarked, radiating the faintest pulse of heat. "Swing it," he said. "The blade carries the weight of every achievement you have earned since your class change. If you are worthy, the sword will answer. If you are not," he did not finish. Jin walked to the pedestal. He wrapped his fingers around the grip. The metal was warm, almost alive, humming against his palm like a second heartbeat. He swung. The hall erupted. The first arc of the blade froze the air itself. Frost crackled across the stone floor, spread up the walls, and turned every breath in the room to white vapor. Darren staggered. Corvin's eyes went wide. Jin swung again. A dragon burst from the steel, not a phantom, not an illusion, a living coil of blue fire that spiraled upward through the ceiling, shattering dust and silence alike. The roar shook the foundations of the tower. Sacred bells rang from somewhere deep below, bells that had not sounded in 100 years. Serath dropped to his knees, not from the force, from recognition. His hands trembled against the stone floor, and when he raised his head, his hollow eyes were full of something that looked dangerously close to faith. "The prophecy," he whispered, "it is fulfilled." The sword dissolved. It did not break. It did not shatter. It poured into Jin like water into earth, absorbed through his hands and his blood, and the forge fire that had lived in him since the day he first touched an anvil. A light blazed through the hall, blinding and brief, and when it faded, Jin stood alone in the center with empty hands and a new title burning across his vision: God of the Forge. Corvin let out a strangled cry. His fists clenched at his sides, fury and disbelief warring across his face. He had spent decades in this tower. He had mastered bowcraft at a level few could match, and the sword had chosen an outsider, a classless wanderer who had walked through the front door less than a year ago. "I don't accept this," Corvin snarled. The room went still. Corvin stepped forward, purple energy coiling around his shoulders like smoke. His eyes burned red in the dim light, and his voice carried the weight of wounded pride and decades of denied ambition. "A blacksmith duel," he said. "You and me. If you win, I will acknowledge you as the successor. But if I win, you renounce the title the sword chose for you." Darren shouted from across the hall. "He has lost his reason. Restrain him." No one moved. The other tower masters watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Corvin smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You could always flee," he said. "Walk away. I will give you the position of Vice Tower Master. All you have to do is accept my authority and learn to obey." Jin looked at him. The forge heat in his blood did not flicker. It burned steady and certain, the way it always did when the world tried to tell him he did not belong. "I accept the duel," Jin said. Flames erupted around him, not from a torch or a furnace, but from Jin himself, rising from his shoulders, curling around his arms, wrapping the God of the Forge title in living fire. The tower masters stepped back. Serath watched from the floor, with his hands still pressed to the stone. Corvin's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then he recovered and gestured toward the forging hall. "We forge. We imbue our weapons with everything we are. Then we clash until one breaks." He turned his back. "See you tomorrow." Darren caught Jin's arm as Corvin left. The old tower master's face was tight with worry. "You accepted too quickly," Darren said. "Corvin is the strongest craftsman among the tower masters. Even with a divine title, you cannot afford to underestimate him." Jin looked toward the forging hall. The anvils gleamed in the low light, ancient and waiting. "Then I won't," he said. But the duel was tomorrow, and tonight, Jin had something else to finish. He had already been crafting it for days. The Dragonlight sword, a blade modeled after a relic his father had restored in the real world, a curved ring pommel sword with a dragon carved into the grip. Jin had built the original at 53 53% effectiveness during an emergency. This time, he was building it perfect. The commission had come from a dragon knight named Kieran, domestic ranking 21st, unaffiliated, desperate. Kieran's grandfather was dying. The old man had dementia. His mind was a fog of fading memories and disconnected words. But one thing cut through the haze with crystal clarity. He wanted to see a dragon, not a picture, not a video. A real, living dragon, even if it only existed inside the world of Aegis. Kieran had searched everywhere. He had contacted every guild, every crafter, every specialist. The answer was always the same. Dragon-imbued artifacts were impossible. The system did not support it. The best analyst in the country gave it a 99.9% chance of failure, but Jin was the 0.1%. He had proven it when Kieran visited his shop. Jin had thrown the unfinished dragon light sword across the room, and a small dragon had erupted from the grip. A living thing made of light and fire, coiling through the air for 3 impossible seconds before vanishing. Kieran had stared at the empty air where the dragon had been. Then he had turned to Jin, and for the first time in months, the desperation in his eyes had been replaced by something else. "Write down your price," Kieran had said. Anything. The grandfather's condition worsened. Kieran sent a message in the middle of the night. His grandfather might not survive until morning. The doctors had told the family to prepare their hearts. There was no time left. Jin stopped crafting. He thought for a long moment. Then he sent hawks. Not one, a dozen. Messenger birds streaking across the game world to every ally Jin had built, every NPC who owed him a debt, every lord whose territory stood between the starting zone and Jin's forge in Ashenmoor. Lady Erin received the first hawk in Stonehelm. Lord Varen received the second in the beginner zone. Aldrich received the third in Thornwall. Marin received the fourth with her knights. The message was the same to all of them. An old man was logging into Aegis for the first time. He was level 1. He had dementia. He needed to cross half the world in a single night to reach Ashenmoor before his body gave out in the real world. Clear the roads. Lord Varen read the note and stood from his chair. "Open every gate," he ordered. "Clear every path from here to the border." The old man logged in. He appeared in the starting zone, confused, blinking at a world that was too bright and too vast and too beautiful for his fading mind to process. A blacksmith named Renly was waiting for him. Renly bowed and said he had been sent by Jin. They moved fast, a carriage through the beginner zone, horseback through the wilds, with Harlan riding beside the old man, cutting down every monster that dared approach. Aldrich took over at the border of Thornwall, his sword clearing the road ahead. Then Marin and her knights, hundreds of them, thundering through the final stretch to Ashenmoor. The old man saw none of the danger. He saw forests and rivers and stars. He laughed like a child being carried through a fairground. Jin finished the sword at dawn. He struck the final blow, and the forge erupted with blue light. The dragon light sword lay on the anvil, perfect. Not the emergency version, not the 53% imitation, the real thing. A legendary blade with a dragon sleeping inside its grip, waiting to wake. When Kieran's grandfather arrived at the shop, carried by knights who set him down as gently as if he were made of glass, Jin lifted the sword. The dragon emerged. It was not small this time. It was enormous. A serpent of blue fire that uncoiled from the blade and rose through the roof of the forge, through the sky above Ashenmoor, climbing higher and higher until it filled the heavens. Its scales caught the light of both moons. Its eyes burned like twin stars. Its wings spread across the horizon, and when it roared, the sound reached every corner of the territory. The old man stood in the street with his mouth open and his eyes wide, and his mind, for one impossible moment, perfectly clear. A dragon, he breathed. A real dragon. He turned to his grandson. Tears ran down his face, but he was smiling. The fog of dementia had lifted just long enough for him to see the one thing he had wanted most in the world. "I really wanted to show you," the old man said to Kieran's father, who stood beside them in stunned silence. A real dragon. Hours later, in a hospital room far from the game, the old man passed away. His expression was peaceful. The monitors flatlined in a quiet room, and the family wept. And somewhere inside the world of Aegis, a dragon made of blue fire still hung in the sky above a blacksmith's forge. Jin wrote one word on the commission note. Lyra had expected billions. She had listed the possibilities: gold, resources, territory rights, political favors. Kieran had given Jin a blank check, literally, a piece of paper on which he could write any price in the world. Jin wrote, "Reset." Lyra stared at the paper. What does that mean? Jin did not explain, but his eyes were steady, and the words sat on the page like a promise, or a warning, or the first move in a game no one else could see yet. Kieran received the note. He stared at it for a long time. Then he laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes after grief has passed through you and left you lighter on the other side. He joined Guild Radiance the next day, walked into Jin's forge, knelt, and called him master. Not because of the sword, not because of the dragon, because Jin had done something that no amount of gold or ranking could buy. He had given an old man one perfect moment before the end. Kieran's father, Chairman Yoon of the Valorian Group, arrived at Jin's real-world forge site a week later. The burned-out husk of the old workshop was being rebuilt, slowly, cheaply, by a construction crew that was doing its best with a limited budget. Chairman Yoon brought his own crew, Valorian Construction, the best builders in the country, premium materials, master-grade tools, a timeline that cut the rebuild from 3 years to 6 months. "I saw the sword your father restored in the National Museum," Chairman Yoon said. "The Dragon Light Sword. I stood in front of it and remembered what it felt like to believe in something." He paused. "I will protect the last master craftsman." Jin signed the agreement. His hands were steady, but something behind his eyes shifted. For the first time since the fire that had ruined his father, someone with real power had looked at his craft and seen something worth protecting. The broadcast changed everything. Lyra had planned it for weeks, an unboxing special on Ironcast Broadcasting. Kieran would open the Dragon Light Sword on a live stream, revealing its full power to the world. The trailer went up on Streamvault. Comments exploded. Rankers flooded Jin's forge courtyard with messages. Ashton, the top-ranked archer, posted daily asking when Jin would forge his bow. The rival blacksmiths noticed. Gareth, the second-ranked smith and master of the Black Anvil Guild, watched from his office as the viewer count climbed past 100,000, then 200, then 300. His employee burst through the door with a phone screen showing breaking news. The sword Jin had forged for Draven, the Sword King, had been listed on the auction house. Its grade was legendary. 2 legendary artifacts from a blacksmith who had been active for less than 6 months. In a private group chat, the top smiths scrambled. Gareth, Steelhand, Ashforge, Bronzeclaw, Hammerwick, all of them typing faster than they could think. "He is coming for our position," one of them wrote. "We need countermeasures," another replied. They were right. Jin's forge climbed from 48th place to 19th in a single night. 700,000 subscribers, and the number was still rising. Jin visited his father in the hospital that evening. The old man lay in the bed, unresponsive, sustained by machines and the stubborn hope of a son who refused to let go. Jin sat beside him and placed his hand on the blanket. "It's all thanks to you, Dad," he said. Then he logged back into Aegis, checked the dual notification waiting in his inbox, and walked toward the forging hall where Corvin was already heating his anvil. The god of the forge had claimed his title. Now he had to prove he deserved it. Corvin was already waiting. The forging hall glowed amber and red, heat rolling off the furnaces in waves that blurred the air. Corvin stood at his anvil, with his sleeves rolled past his elbows and his jaw set like a man who had already decided the outcome. His hammer rested beside him, heavy and familiar, the tool of a craftsman who had spent his entire life proving he belonged. Jin stepped through the archway and said nothing. He crossed the hall, selected an anvil on the opposite side, and began to work. The duel was simple. Each of them would forge one sword. Then they would clash until one blade broke. The loser would kneel. Corvin struck first, not with a weapon, but with rhythm. His hammer fell in precise, thundering beats, each blow sending sparks cascading across the stone floor. He was fast, brutally fast. The metal sang under his hands, shaping itself as though it wanted to obey him. Jin watched from the corner of his eye. Then he turned back to his own steel and let the forge fire answer. Corvin had not always been the tower master of bows. Once, he had been destined for swords. His father had been a swordsmith, his grandfather before that. The craft ran through his blood like an inheritance he never asked for, but could not refuse. He had trained with blades since childhood, forging them, swinging them, sleeping beside them in the workshop, while his father hammered through the night. Then Varn had arrived. Varn, the tower master of swords, had surpassed him, not through treachery or politics, but through raw, undeniable talent. Corvin had watched the position he was born for slip through his fingers and land in the hands of someone who had simply been better. He had swallowed his pride, moved to the bow tower, built a career out of a consolation prize, and told himself it was enough. But it was never enough. And now an outsider, a wandering blacksmith with no lineage and no tower behind him, had walked into the Hall of Smiths and been crowned successor to the god of the forge. The sword had chosen Jin. The divine messenger had knelt. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and Corvin had stood in the shadows, watching everything he believed about merit and bloodline crumble to dust. He would not accept it. not without a fight. His hammer struck the anvil so hard the sound rang through the entire tower. Jin worked through the night. He did not forge a sword of raw power. He did not chase the highest grade or the flashiest enchantment. Instead, he thought about what a dual sword actually needed to do. Break the enemy's weapon. That was the win condition. Not damage, not speed, not rank. If one blade shattered, the duel was over. So Jin built his entire sword around a single concept: destruction. He called on the skill that had come with his divine class: divine customization. It allowed him to imbue any artifact with a chosen effect, but the difficulty scaled with ambition. The higher the enchantment, the harder the forge. Most smiths would aim for balance, spread the power evenly, play it safe. Jin did the opposite. He poured everything into one attribute: breaking power. A sword built to shatter other swords, designed from grip to edge to do nothing but destroy whatever it touched. The trade-off was brutal. The blade's rank would drop. Its raw stats would pale next to anything Corvin could produce. On paper, it would look like the work of an amateur, but Jin understood something that paper could not measure. The value of a sword was not determined by its rank. Sweat rolled down his face. The metal glowed white under his hammer. He shaped the edge with careful, deliberate strikes, each one placing the enchantment deeper into the steel, layering it like sediment in ancient stone. By the time dawn crept through the forging hall windows, the blade was finished. He held it up. The light caught it, and for a moment, it looked almost ordinary. A simple sword, rare grade, nothing that would turn heads in a display case. But inside that steel, something waited, patient and absolute. Corvin unveiled his sword first. He held it high, and the hall went silent. The blade gleamed with a purple aura that pulsed like a living heartbeat. Its stats floated in the air for all to see. Unique grade, devastating attack power, enhanced durability, active abilities layered with family techniques passed down through generations of master smiths. It was, by every measurable standard, a masterpiece. Varn wiped the sweat from his brow. Even he could not deny it. Corvin had forged a perfect dual sword in a single night, something that should have taken weeks. Incredible, Varn murmured. The other tower masters whispered among themselves. Two of them stood at the edge of the hall, their faces pale with disbelief. A unique grade weapon, built in hours, by a man burning with something far more dangerous than skill. Corvin turned to Jin. His smile was sharp and certain, the smile of a man who had already written the ending in his head. "Show me your sword," he said. Jin drew his blade. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted Corvin's weapon. This silence was confused, uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that fills a room when people realize something has gone wrong but cannot name what it is. The stats appeared: rare grade, attack power far below Corvin's, durability respectable but unremarkable. On every visible metric, it was inferior. A journeyman's blade standing across from a master's opus. One of the tower masters frowned. Another shook his head. Corvin stared at the sword. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Not triumph, something darker. Disappointment, maybe. Or the suspicion that this was a trick he could not yet see. Then, he raised his blade and attacked. The first clash shook the hall. Corvin came in fast, his unique grade sword cutting through the air with a violet streak of energy. The strike was precise, powerful, the culmination of decades of technique compressed into a single arc. Jin met it with his rare grade blade. Steel screamed against steel. Sparks erupted in a blinding shower that scattered across the floor. The impact sent tremors through the stone beneath their feet, and for one breathless moment, neither sword moved. Then a crack appeared, not on Jin's blade, on Corvin's. The fracture spread like lightning through glass, racing from the point of contact down to the guard. Corvin's eyes went wide. He pulled back, staring at the damage, and something in his expression collapsed. "How?" he breathed. Jin did not answer. He stepped forward and swung again. The second strike hit Corvin's sword at the exact point where the crack had begun. The enchantment buried in Jin's blade activated with a sound like a bell being struck in an empty cathedral. A pulse of force radiated outward, and Corvin's weapon, his unique grade masterpiece forged with family secrets and generational pride, shattered. Fragments of purple steel rained across the hall. They hit the floor like broken promises, each piece catching the firelight as it fell. Corvin stood with the hilt in his hand and nothing else. The room held its breath. Nobody moved. The tower masters stood frozen along the walls, their faces cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked like the first tremor of understanding. Varn's mouth hung open. He stared at the broken fragments of Corvin's sword, then at Jin, then back at the fragments, as though checking to make sure the world had not rearranged itself when he was not looking. "Then Corvin was right all along," Varn whispered, and the words carried more weight than he intended. Jin lowered his sword. The rare grade blade still hummed in his grip. unmarked, uncracked, vibrating with the quiet certainty of something that had done exactly what it was built to do. Its hidden skill had fired true, a 65% chance to shatter the opponent's weapon on contact. Jin had not gambled on luck. He had engineered certainty out of probability, stacking the odds so high that the outcome felt less like chance and more like gravity. A prophecy hung in the air. Old words spoken in this very tower generations before Jin had ever touched an anvil. One day, the god of the forge will come to this land. He will break what others thought unbreakable. He will teach what no master has dared to teach. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a young apprentice remembered being told those words by her father. She had dreamed of meeting the god of the forge since she was a child. Her hands trembled at her sides. Corvin did not tremble. He stood perfectly still, the broken hilt in his grip, his eyes fixed on the floor, where the fragments of his pride lay scattered among the ash. He understood now. It did not matter that Jin's sword was rare grade. It did not matter that Corvin's had been unique. Rank was a number, a label stamped on steel by a system that measured weight and sharpness and magical density. But the system could not measure intent. It could not measure the mind behind the forge, the vision that turned a simple blade into a weapon that existed for one purpose and fulfilled it absolutely. Jin had not outforged him. Jin had outthought him. Corvin dropped the hilt. It clattered against the stone, and the sound echoed through the hall like a door closing. He lowered himself to one knee. "I am Corvin," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by something larger than defeat. "Tower Master of Bows, I denied you. I called you an outsider. I demanded proof that you deserved what the sword chose to give you." He paused, his fists clenched against his thigh. "I was wrong." He raised his head. His eyes were bright and fierce, not with anger anymore, but with something that burned hotter and lasted longer. "I pay my respects," Corvin said, "to the god of the forge." Light erupted through the hall, not from the furnaces, not from the anvils, from the stone itself, from the walls and the floor, and the ancient sigils carved into the ceiling by hands that had believed in this moment centuries before it arrived. The light poured over Jin like a baptism, warm and heavy and final. The notification appeared in his vision, simple and absolute. Blacksmith duel, mission complete. Jin looked down at Corvin. He did not gloat. He did not lecture. He extended his hand. "Stand up," Jin said quietly. "We have work to do." Corvin stared at the hand for a long moment. Then he took it and let the god of the forge pull him to his feet. The Tower of Smiths had not given a gift in over a century. Jin stood in the great hall, dust motes drifting through shafts of golden light, and watched two of the tower's eldest smiths approach him with an ornate chest held between them like a relic. Their steps were slow, reverent, the walk of men carrying something they believed they would never carry again. "Please accept this," the elder said, and placed the chest at Jin's feet. Jin opened it. 500 gold gleamed inside, bright and heavy, each coin stamped with the hammer and anvil sigil of the tower, a mission reward. But it was not the gold that made him pause. It was the scroll. The second smith produced it from a silk-lined case, handling it with the kind of care usually reserved for newborns and loaded weapons. A crafting blueprint, not just any blueprint, one of the 10 treasures of the Tower of Smiths, passed down from the first master, a legendary bow that no living smith had ever completed. "Even I could not finish this bow," the elder admitted. His voice held no shame, only truth. "But you walk the path of the strong. The god of the forge has returned, and these treasures belong to him now." Jin held the scroll. The ink shimmered under his fingers, alive with the faint pulse of something ancient. He could feel the weapon inside it, waiting to be born. The elder straightened. "We will strive forward alongside you. From this day, the tower serves its god." Jin rolled the scroll carefully and tucked it into his pack. Through the great windows behind him, the world of Aegis stretched out in every direction, vast and uncharted, glowing under a sky full of stars. The growth of a god had begun. The real world smelled like cheap beer and exhaust fumes. Jin sat on a plastic chair outside a convenience store, legs stretched across the sidewalk, watching traffic crawl past in the evening heat. Across from him, Sarah clinked her can against his and grinned so wide it looked like it hurt. "I cannot believe you are actually buying me a drink," she said. "The Jin I know would sooner forge a sword out of pocket lint than spend money on beer. Things change." "Things change?" She leaned forward, eyes bright. "You got a divine class. A divine class, Jin. I told you to play Aegis because your talent was being wasted at that forge, and you went and became a literal god." She laughed and shook her head. "I always knew you were good with your hands, but I never thought you would be this good at games." Jin took a sip. The beer was warm. He did not care. "Not much has changed, honestly," he said. "The class is new, but I still need to level up. Build a reputation, the usual grind." Sarah's grin faded. She knew him too well. She could hear the weight behind the words. "The hospital bills," she said quietly. Jin stared at the can in his hand. "Another 10 million won got added. There is a new medication for my father, but it is not covered by insurance. 20 million won minimum." The silence between them was loud. Between the burn treatment, the surgery costs, and everything else, Jin said, "What I make is not enough, not even close." Sarah opened her mouth to say something encouraging, something about how it would work out. Then she closed it. She had known Jin long enough to understand that empty comfort was the one thing he could not use. Jin crushed the empty can in his fist. His eyes were steady, the same eyes that had stared down a divine trial and refused to blink. "The growth of a god starts now," he said. The broadcast had set the world on fire. Kieran's unboxing stream of the Dragon Lightsword had shattered every record on the platform. 300,000 concurrent viewers, comments flooding in faster than moderators could read them. The legendary blade, glowing with dragonfire on a live feed, had turned Jin's name from a rumor into a headline. But it was the second piece of news that sent the blacksmith community into a panic. The sword Jin had forged for Draven, the Sword King, appeared on the auction house. Legendary grade. The forums erupted. Screenshots spread across every gaming site in the country. 2 legendary artifacts from the same smith, a man who had been active for less than 6 months. In a private group chat, the top-ranked smiths scrambled like rats hearing thunder. "He is coming for our position. We need countermeasures, now." Jin's forge climbed from 48th place to 19th overnight. 700,000 subscribers and counting. The number did not stop rising. None of it mattered yet, not to Jin. He sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. The screen showed his bank balance, and the hospital bill deadline glowing red beneath it. 30 million won per month. Even with the mission rewards and auction house profits, the math did not work. Then his phone buzzed. A notification from Aegis. A weapon he had crafted weeks ago had sold on the secondary market. 53,000 gold. Jin stared at the number, stared at it again. His hands went still. 53,000, he whispered. He was on his feet before the thought finished forming. He ran to the billing office, burst through the door, and startled the clerk so badly she nearly dropped her coffee. "The hospital bill," Jin said, breathing hard. "I am paying it, all of it, right now." He walked out of the billing office and stopped on the sidewalk. The evening air hit his face, warm and heavy with the smell of rain. Traffic moved around him. People passed. The world kept turning the way it always did, indifferent to the fact that for the first time in months, Jin could breathe without the weight of a deadline crushing his chest. But the relief lasted exactly as long as it took to think about tomorrow. "I cannot stop playing Aegis," he said to no one. It was not a confession. It was a fact. The hospital bills would come again next month. The medication costs would climb. His father's treatment could not be interrupted, not for a day, not for an hour. The only way to keep up was to keep forging, keep selling, keep climbing. The game had become the forge that kept his father alive. Jin pulled out his phone. A string of messages waited for him, all from the same source. Players who had used his weapons, rankers who had completed trials with his blades. One message stood out from the rest. "Thank you, Lord Jin. Your sword helped me complete Draven's trial." Even the Sword King himself seemed surprised by the blade. Jin read it twice. His mind turned the words over, examining them the way he examined cracks in heated steel. A sword he had forged had reached the hands of the Sword King, and the Sword King had noticed. The summons arrived like a thunderclap. Jin was sitting in his apartment when his phone lit up with a message from a courier in Aegis, not a player, an NPC messenger from the kingdom of Valdris. The words were formal, archaic, and carried the kind of weight that made his pulse quicken. "The Sword King Draven awaits you. Please come to him." Jin set the phone down slowly. He knew who Draven was. Everyone did. The king of Valdris, the strongest swordsman in Aegis, a man so powerful that his very existence shaped the balance of the entire game world. And now that man wanted to see a blacksmith. But before Jin could process the summons, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Draven was not summoning him out of curiosity. A message from Theron, the knight captain who served under Draven, explained the rest. Marin, the vice captain of Valdris's knight order, was dying, 19 years old, talented beyond her generation, and sick with a disease that no healer, no potion, no spell could touch. The only cure was a saint's prayer, a miracle that could be performed exactly twice in a saint's lifetime. But the Saintess Alara had been kidnapped by the Order of Ruin, and no one knew where she was being held. Draven needed someone who could win the Saintess's heart, someone whose craft could move a saint to pray. He needed the god of the forge. Jin clenched his fist. Real-world money, his father's treatment, the forge rebuild, all of it hung on what happened next inside Aegis. And now, the most powerful figure in the game was asking for his help. He could not say no. He could not afford to. But there was a problem. Jin logged in and immediately called Sarah. Her voice came through clear and amused, the way it always did when she knew he was about to ask for something impossible. "You want to meet Draven," she said. "The Sword King, the ruler of an entire kingdom, the man whose throne room requires a minimum level of 200 just to enter." Yes. "Jin, you are nowhere near level 200. He knew that. He also knew that the summons would not wait forever. Draven had given a deadline, 1 month. After that, whatever window existed would close, and Marin's life would slip beyond saving. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, she spoke in the careful, deliberate tone she used when she had already thought 3 steps ahead. "There is one other way. Every year, Draven holds a martial arts tournament in Valdris, open to outsiders. Level restriction between 50 and 60. He holds it because he is always searching for talent, testing the next generation. When is it? Soon. Very soon." She paused. "The winner receives their prize directly from Draven, face to face. It is the only way someone at your level gets an audience with the king." Jin closed his eyes. A tournament, not a crafting competition, a fighting tournament. He was a blacksmith. His class was built around the forge, not the battlefield, but he had fought orcs. He had dueled Corvin. He had stood on a ridge with blood on his blade and watched an army break. "I will enter," Jin said. Sarah had one more piece of advice. "Go to Thornwall territory," she said. "It sits on the border between the Primordial Kingdom and the Kingdom of Valdris. The undead have been pushing into it for months. It is a war zone. And you want me to walk into a war zone because it is the fastest place to level up in the entire game. Varn told me. The only place where a smith at your level can gain enough experience to compete in the tournament without getting laughed off the stage." Jin stood in the quiet of his room, the phone pressed to his ear, and thought about what waited for him. Undead armies, a dying girl he had never met, a king whose gaze could break lesser men, a tournament he had no business entering, and behind all of it, always, the hospital bed where his father lay motionless, sustained by machines, and the stubborn refusal of a son who would not let go. He could not stop. He could not slow down. Every moment he spent hesitating was a moment his father's treatment went unfunded, a moment Marin crept closer to death, a moment the forge that kept his world together cooled by another degree. Jin ended the call. He equipped his gear, checked his blade, and opened the map to Thornwall. The territory appeared on his screen like a scar across the landscape. Dark, scarred, crawling with the dead. A fortress city under siege, its walls cracked, its defenders exhausted, its fields choked with ash and bone, exactly where he needed to be. Jin stepped through the gate and felt the air change, cold, stale, the smell of rot and iron. In the distance, beyond the crumbling walls, something howled. Not wolves, not orcs, something worse. He drew his blade and walked forward. The god of the forge had claimed his title, won his duel, and set the world of Aegis ablaze with dragonfire and legendary steel. But titles did not pay hospital bills. Legends did not cure dying girls. And gods, even forged ones, still had to earn the right to stand before a king. Jin disappeared into the shadow of Thornwall's gates, alone, walking toward a war that would either forge him into something unstoppable or break him entirely. The hammer had not yet fallen, but the anvil was waiting, and Jin had never once flinched from the strike.